The concept of a Boltzmann brain arises from a thought experiment that explores the nature of our reality and the strange implications of statistical mechanics. Named after the physicist Ludwig Boltzmann, the idea suggests that, given an infinite universe and enough time, it's statistically more likely that a brain could spontaneously form out of pure chaos, complete with false memories, than for a complex, orderly universe like the one we experience to exist in the first place. The core idea behind the Boltzmann brain hypothesis stems from the way probability works in an infinite system. In an infinite universe, all possibilities are given infinite time to unfold. So, if every possible arrangement of particles can occur, even highly improbable events become likely over a long enough timeline. This means that a random collection of particles under the right conditions could spontaneously form a brain. The brain would not be the result of the evolution of a living organism, as we understand it, but rather a random fluctuation in the fabric of the universe. This brain would have no physical origin, but would exist, if only for a fleeting moment, with fully formed memories and perceptions, including the memory of having lived a full life. In a sense, this brain would be a kind of illusion, its memories fabricated entirely by the random configuration of particles without any actual experiences or history. It would think it had a life, but this life would be a fabrication, created out of thin air. The Boltzmann brain does not require a universe to evolve into something orderly. It could emerge in the most chaotic environments, popping into existence momentarily before vanishing into the randomness that surrounds it. This raises an unsettling question about our own existence. If such brains are statistically more likely than fully evolved human beings, how can we be sure that we aren't just a random brain experiencing false memories? What if our entire sense of self, all our experiences, the memories we cherish, and the universe we interact with are simply illusions created by a statistical fluctuation in the universe's chaos? The idea of the Boltzmann brain can be deeply disorienting because it challenges the very foundation of our understanding of reality. If it's more likely that we are random brains than actual conscious beings living in a real universe, then our perceptions of the world around us might be fundamentally unreliable. Perhaps we are not experiencing a coherent universe at all, but instead are a brain with fabricated memories, disconnected from any true external reality. This possibility forces us to question what we can truly know about the world and whether our perceptions can ever be trusted. To illustrate this idea with a simple example, imagine a machine that generates random sequences of numbers. If given infinite time, the machine will eventually produce every possible sequence, including the exact sequence of numbers that represents the laws of physics in our universe. At some point, the machine might generate a sequence that reflects the configuration of particles in your brain, including the memories and perceptions you have of being a person. In this case, the you that experiences the world might simply be a brief flicker of consciousness, created from a random collection of numbers, and your memories of your life might be nothing more than an illusion. The Boltzmann brain hypothesis plays a crucial role in discussions about the nature of the universe. It presents a paradox. If we are more likely to be Boltzmann brains than actual evolved beings, then we should question the legitimacy of any observation that suggests our existence is real. After all, if our memories and perceptions are fabricated, we can never be sure if anything outside our mind is real. This leads to what some philosophers and physicists call the Boltzmann brain problem. The problem is that, given a sufficiently large and chaotic universe, it may be statistically inevitable for random brains to emerge, brains that are convinced they are experiencing a coherent, orderly universe even though they are not. This brings us to a deeper question about the nature of knowledge itself. If our understanding of reality is based solely on our perceptions and memories, how can we ever be certain that our experiences are grounded in a real world, rather than the fabrication of a random brain? In essence, we might be trapped in a cycle of doubt, constantly questioning the nature of our own existence. The Boltzmann brain theory doesn't just challenge our sense of reality. It questions our ability to know anything at all with certainty. The most perplexing aspect of the Boltzmann brain hypothesis is its implications for the universe's nature. If the emergence of a random brain is more likely than the formation of a universe like ours, it would suggest that the universe we perceive is somehow an anomaly. Our universe, with its order and structure, may be an extraordinarily rare occurrence in the vastness of time and space. This would make our existence, as conscious beings in a stable universe, an almost miraculous event, one that is overshadowed by the far more probable creation of fleeting, disembodied brains with false memories. In this view, the universe itself might appear insignificant in the grand scheme of things, a mere glitch in the infinite randomness of the cosmos. It's important to note, however, that this thought experiment doesn't necessarily mean that we are, in fact, Boltzmann brains. The idea is primarily a tool for thinking about probability and the nature of reality, not a definitive theory about our existence. In practice, the likelihood of any given brain emerging from pure chaos is infinitesimally small, and many scientists argue that the conditions required for a Boltzmann brain to exist are so extreme that it's not worth worrying about. Moreover, the Boltzmann brain hypothesis is tied to a particular view of the universe, one that is infinite and governed by the laws of probability in a way that allows for random fluctuations. If the universe is finite or operates under different rules, the Boltzmann brain might not be a significant concern. Still, the thought experiment raises important questions about the limitations of our understanding and the reliability of our senses. While the Boltzmann brain hypothesis is a fascinating intellectual exercise, it also highlights a broader philosophical issue, the problem of epistemology, or the study of knowledge. How do we know what we know? And, more fundamentally, how do we know that we know anything at all? If we cannot be certain of the nature of our own existence, then everything else we experience becomes suspect. The Boltzmann brain is a reminder of the fragility of knowledge and the deep uncertainty that underlies our understanding of the universe. In conclusion, the Boltzmann brain hypothesis is a striking and unsettling idea that challenges our assumptions about reality, consciousness, and knowledge. It forces us to confront the possibility that our experiences are not what they seem and that we may, in fact, be living in an illusion. While it is unlikely that we are actually Boltzmann brains, the thought experiment remains a powerful reminder of the limitations of human perception and the complexities of understanding the universe. The invisible gorilla paradox stems from a famous psychological experiment that reveals a profound flaw in human attention. The study, conducted by psychologists Christopher Chabry and Daniel Simons, asked participants to watch a video where two teams, one in white shirts and one in black shirts, passed a basketball to one another. Participants were instructed to count how many passes the players in white shirts made. While they were focused on counting the passes, something remarkable occurred. A person dressed in a gorilla suit casually walked through the middle of the scene, paused to face the camera, and then walked off. Despite the gorilla's conspicuous presence, about half of the viewers completely missed it. This experiment demonstrates a critical aspect of human attention and perception. When people focus intensely on a task, they often miss obvious events occurring right before them. The paradox here is that the more concentrated you are on something, the more likely you are to overlook something else, no matter how noticeable it is. This phenomenon is known as inattentional blindness. It's not just about missing a gorilla. It's about the way our brain processes information and how it decides what to focus on. The invisible gorilla paradox challenges our assumption that we see and understand the world around us accurately. We tend to believe that if something is in our field of vision, we are aware of it, but this experiment shows otherwise. Our attention is finite. It's not a matter of simply seeing everything that is visible to us, but of selecting what we deem important enough to pay attention to. When we focus on one task, our brain suppresses other stimuli, making them disappear from our conscious awareness, even though they are right in front of us. This blindness to the obvious can happen in all sorts of situations, not just in a controlled experiment. For example, in daily life, people often miss things right under their noses. Imagine you're driving, and you're concentrating hard on the road ahead, ensuring you stay in your lane. A friend in the passenger seat might be pointing out something interesting, maybe a car passing by or a landmark, but you don't notice because your attention is entirely on the task of driving. This is a real-world example of how focusing on a particular thing can cause you to miss others, even if they are just as significant. The paradox goes beyond just the idea of missing something obvious. It raises questions about how much we truly perceive. If we can miss a gorilla in the middle of a video, what else might we be missing in our everyday lives? There is an entire world around us that we are not fully aware of, even though we think we are seeing everything. We are constantly bombarded with information, but our brains prioritize certain stimuli, ignoring the rest. This selective attention is essential for survival because it allows us to focus on what matters most. However, it also means that our perception of reality is incomplete and distorted. This concept is further illustrated by the idea that our brains are essentially filtering out most of the information around us, choosing only what it considers important or relevant. For instance, when you're in a crowded room, you might tune out a lot of background noise, focusing on the conversation you're having. You may not even notice the hum of a nearby fan or the sound of footsteps from across the room. In the same way, during the gorilla experiment, the participants' brains filtered out the appearance of the gorilla, deeming it irrelevant to the task at hand. Inattentional blindness is more than just a trick of the mind. It can have significant implications in real-world situations, such as in driving, where focusing on the road might cause you to miss critical events around you, like a pedestrian crossing or another car running a red light. Similarly, in high-pressure work environments, a person might focus so intently on completing one task that they fail to notice other important signs or cues. For instance, a doctor might focus on a patient's symptoms but miss a subtle sign that points to a different, potentially dangerous condition. In these cases, the consequences of inattentional blindness can be dire, and the invisible gorilla paradox highlights how it affects critical decision-making. The paradox is also relevant in areas like law enforcement and eyewitness testimony. A police officer who is concentrating on an interview might fail to notice an important detail in the background. A person giving a witness statement might focus so intently on what they remember seeing that they fail to acknowledge other relevant aspects of the event. This can lead to false memories or incomplete recollections of events, where people are certain of what they saw but fail to account for the things they missed. The phenomenon also speaks to the limitations of human memory. When we focus on one thing, we remember it clearly, but the rest of the scene might be blurry or completely forgotten. This has implications for how we interpret our experiences and our understanding of the world. We assume that our perception and memory are accurate, but the invisible gorilla paradox shows us that our minds can only focus on so much at once. When we recount a memory, we often leave out large portions of the scene because our brains didn't prioritize those details at the time. The paradox also highlights how our expectations shape our perception. In the gorilla experiment, participants were asked to count passes, so their minds were already primed to look for that specific action. As a result, when the gorilla walked through, it didn't fit into the category of things they were expecting to see, so their brains ignored it. In everyday life, our expectations about what should happen or what is important shape how we perceive the world. If we're expecting to see a friend in a particular location, we're more likely to notice them, even if we're looking for something else entirely. But if the situation doesn't fit our expectations, we might miss the person entirely, just like missing the gorilla. This leads to another important insight: the limitations of human attention. The invisible gorilla paradox shows that we are not as good at multitasking as we often think. We are constantly switching our attention between different things, but this process takes time, and we often miss things when we do. This is why multitasking often leads to mistakes. For example, when people check their phones while driving or talking to others, they are not fully present in the moment. As a result, they are more likely to miss important cues and make errors in judgment. The paradox also challenges the idea that we have complete control over our perceptions. We often believe that we are in charge of what we pay attention to, but in reality, much of it is automatic. Our brains are constantly filtering and processing information, sometimes without our conscious awareness. The invisible gorilla paradox illustrates how little control we have over what we notice and how our minds prioritize information. In the end, the invisible gorilla paradox offers a powerful reminder about the nature of human perception. It shows that our attention is limited and that we miss much of what is happening around us. The more focused we are on a task, the more likely we are to overlook something obvious. It forces us to reconsider the reliability of our senses and to question how much of the world we are truly aware of. Despite our belief that we see everything, we are often blind to the most important things right in front of us. Goodman's new riddle of induction challenges our understanding of how we form beliefs about the future based on past observations. The problem starts with a simple question: why do we believe emeralds will stay green rather than suddenly becoming blue? We observe emeralds being green, and based on this observation, we predict that future emeralds will also be green. However, Goodman introduces an alternative hypothesis. Instead of green, what if emeralds are actually GRU? According to Goodman, GRU refers to objects that are green until 2025 and blue after that time. If we observe an emerald and it is green, how can we be sure it won't suddenly become blue after a certain time? Why do we confidently predict that emeralds will continue to be green, but not that they will become blue once a certain condition is met? The riddle exposes a deeper problem with inductive reasoning, which is the process we use to make generalizations about the world based on our experiences. When we observe emeralds being green, we assume that future emeralds will also be green, relying on past evidence to support our predictions. However, Goodman's riddle shows that this assumption might not be as solid as it seems. We could just as easily predict that emeralds will be GRU based on our observations. If emeralds were GRU, they would behave in the same way as green emeralds before 2025, but their color would change after that time. So, how do we justify the belief that emeralds will continue to be green and not blue after 2025? The issue with this question lies in the concept of projectability. When we make inductive inferences, we assume that certain properties of objects, like the color of emeralds, will continue in the same way in the future. But Goodman's riddle points out that we have no clear basis for choosing one property, green, over another GRU, when making predictions. Both are logically consistent with past observations, yet we instinctively prefer the prediction of green emeralds over blue ones. This preference, however, isn't based on a logical or rational principle. Instead, it stems from a deep-seated bias that makes us trust one set of observations, green over another GRU, even though both seem equally valid. To understand the problem more clearly, let's consider a scenario where we observe a series of emeralds and notice they are all green. We form an inductive belief that all future emeralds will also be green. However, imagine that someone presents us with the hypothesis that emeralds are GRU instead. We would argue that the green emeralds we observe today are just as consistent with the GRU hypothesis as they are with the green hypothesis. This is where Goodman's riddle becomes problematic. If both predictions, green and GRU, are equally supported by the evidence, why do we choose one over the other? Goodman's challenge is not just an abstract philosophical problem, it has real-world implications. When we observe patterns in the world, such as the regularity of emeralds being green, we tend to form beliefs that these patterns will continue. But Goodman's riddle forces us to confront the possibility that these beliefs may be based on arbitrary distinctions. Our tendency to favor the green hypothesis over the GRU hypothesis is not a result of logic or rational reasoning. It is a product of our cultural and cognitive biases. We are conditioned to trust the patterns we have observed without questioning whether other equally plausible explanations might exist. The riddle also raises questions about the nature of scientific knowledge and how we justify scientific theories. Scientific theories often rely on inductive reasoning to predict future events based on past observations. For example, scientists might observe that all swans are white, and from this observation, they might conclude that all future swans will also be white. However, as Goodman's riddle suggests, there is nothing inherently special about the color white in this case. A swan could just as easily be blorple, a color that is white until 2025 and then turns purple afterward. The problem is that there is no way to distinguish between the prediction of white swans and the prediction of blorple swans based on past observations alone. Both are equally supported by the evidence. This leads to a more fundamental question about the nature of evidence itself. How do we determine what counts as good evidence for a theory? If we base our beliefs on past observations, then we must confront the possibility that our observations might not be as reliable as we think. The challenge Goodman presents is not just about the nature of induction, but about how we define what constitutes valid evidence in the first place. How do we decide which properties of objects are projectable into the future and which ones are not? There is no simple answer to this question, but Goodman's riddle forces us to consider the limitations of our reasoning and to question the assumptions we make about the world. Goodman's new riddle of induction also has implications for how we think about knowledge and progress. When we predict that emeralds will continue to be green, we are making an assumption about the stability of the world. We assume that the world operates in a consistent and orderly manner, and that past observations will continue to hold true in the future. But Goodman's riddle suggests that this assumption might be unfounded. Our predictions about the future are based on patterns we have observed, but those patterns might be arbitrary. There is no guarantee that the world will continue to behave in the same way it has in the past. The riddle also highlights the role of language in shaping our beliefs. When we describe emeralds as green, we are using a language that reflects our cognitive biases and cultural assumptions. The concept of GRU is an example of how language can be manipulated to create new categories and distinctions that challenge our understanding of the world. By introducing the concept of GRU, Goodman forces us to confront the limits of our language and the arbitrary nature of the categories we use to describe the world. Ultimately, Goodman's riddle is a reflection of the complexities of human reasoning. We rely on inductive reasoning to navigate the world, making predictions based on past observations. But Goodman's challenge shows that there is no simple way to justify our beliefs about the future. The preference for green emeralds over GRU emeralds is not a rational decision. It is a product of our cognitive biases and cultural conditioning. This raises important questions about the nature of knowledge, the reliability of our perceptions, and the limitations of our reasoning abilities. Goodman's new riddle of induction asks us to reconsider how we justify our beliefs and predictions. It forces us to confront the possibility that our inductive reasoning is based on arbitrary distinctions and biases. While we may instinctively believe that emeralds will stay green, Goodman's riddle reminds us that our reasoning processes are not as reliable as we might think. Instead, we must recognize that our beliefs about the future are shaped by the limitations of our reasoning, our language, and our cultural context. The two envelopes paradox presents a situation where logic leads you to an endless loop of decision-making, as you are convinced that you can always do better by switching envelopes. It begins with a simple setup. You are given two envelopes, each containing an unknown amount of money. One envelope has twice the amount of the other. You pick one envelope at random, then are asked whether you should switch to the other envelope. At first, this seems like a straightforward choice. You either stick with your current envelope or switch to the other. But then logic kicks in, suggesting that you should always switch because there's always a better option. This is where the paradox arises. Let's break this down step by step. Suppose the envelope you choose contains a sum of money, say X. The other envelope contains either 2X or X/2. The reasoning goes like this. If the envelope you hold has X, then the other envelope could either have 2X, which is better, or X/2, which is worse. So, in theory, switching gives you a 50% chance of doubling your money and a 50% chance of having it. The expected value of switching is calculated as the average of these two possibilities.
1 δεύτερο 2x, 1 δεύτερο x, 2, x, x, 4 1, 25x.
So, the expected value of switching is 1.25x, which is greater than the value of sticking with the current envelope, X. According to this reasoning, switching seems to be the better choice. But here's where the paradox hits. If switching is always better, why not keep switching indefinitely? After all, each time you switch, the expected value goes up. This leads to an endless cycle of switching envelopes, with no point at which you settle on a choice. This raises a central question. Where is the flaw in the reasoning? On the surface, it looks like a solid mathematical argument. But the paradox stems from a misunderstanding of how expected value works in this scenario. The calculation of 1.25x as the expected value assumes that you know both the value of the envelope you initially chose and the range of possible amounts in the other envelope. However, the setup of the problem doesn't actually give you any specific information about how much money is in either envelope to begin with. The paradox arises because the same reasoning applies no matter which envelope you pick first. In each case, the expected value of switching seems to be greater than what you already have, which suggests that you should keep switching forever. But this can't be right, because it implies that there's no definitive answer, and no envelope ever represents a final choice. To clarify the issue, let's consider a more realistic version of the scenario. Instead of using abstract amounts of money, think of this as a real-world problem where you are given an envelope containing a sum of money, and the other envelope contains a random amount. Once you start to think about the actual process, it becomes clear that there's no reasonable way to keep making these decisions indefinitely. You are limited by the reality of the situation. There's only so much time and effort you can put into switching envelopes, and eventually you must make a choice. The problem also exposes an important principle in probability. The paradox hinges on how you define the expected value of switching. The formula used to calculate 1.25x is based on the assumption that both envelopes are equally likely to contain either value, 2x or x/2. However, this assumption is faulty because it doesn't take into account the underlying probabilities that govern the amounts in the envelopes. In real-world situations, these probabilities would be influenced by factors like the distribution of wealth or the specific rules governing how the envelopes were filled. The paradox assumes a perfect 50-50 split between the two possibilities, which doesn't align with how probability works in actual scenarios. Another way to think about the paradox is to consider the total amount of money in the system. If the total amount of money in both envelopes is fixed, say 1,000 units, then one envelope will contain a certain amount, and the other will contain the remainder. If you pick one envelope, there's no way that switching will lead to a higher expected value beyond what you already have, because the total amount of money doesn't change. This suggests that, in reality, switching envelopes doesn't provide a higher expected value. It's simply an illusion created by the paradoxical reasoning. The two envelopes paradox also sheds light on the broader issue of how we make decisions when faced with uncertainty. In everyday life, we often face situations where we have to make choices based on incomplete information, and our reasoning can lead us to make suboptimal decisions. The paradox serves as a reminder that, while logical reasoning can help us evaluate options, it's important to consider the limitations of our knowledge and the assumptions we're making. In this case, the paradox shows that mathematical reasoning alone may not always lead to the best decision. One possible resolution to the paradox is to acknowledge that the setup of the problem is inherently flawed. In the real world, we wouldn't encounter a scenario in which we are given two envelopes with a fixed, random distribution of money and no additional context. The paradox only arises when we assume that the situation is governed by perfect symmetry between the two envelopes, which is an unrealistic assumption. Once you introduce real-world variables, such as the specific method by which the envelopes were filled or the likelihood of different amounts being in each envelope, the reasoning behind the paradox breaks down. Another possible explanation is that the paradox is based on a misunderstanding of how we interpret probability. When we calculate the expected value of switching, we assume that both outcomes, 2x and x/2, are equally likely. But in reality, these probabilities are not equal. They depend on how the envelopes were filled. If the process by which the envelopes were created has a bias or a distribution that favors one value over the other, the 50-50 assumption no longer holds. This shifts the calculation of the expected value and eliminates the paradox. In essence, the two envelopes paradox serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of relying on overly simplistic logic when making decisions under uncertainty. While the mathematics behind the paradox may seem sound at first glance, it overlooks the complexities of real-world probability and the limitations of our knowledge. In any situation where you are asked to make a choice between two options, it's important to question the assumptions underlying the reasoning and recognize that, sometimes, the better choice is not always as clear-cut as it seems. Skolem's paradox presents an intriguing and unsettling aspect of mathematical logic, particularly in the realm of set theory. The paradox arises from the fact that it is possible to construct a model of a set theory where certain uncountable sets appear to be countable. This is counterintuitive and goes against our typical understanding of what it means for a set to be countable or uncountable. To explore this paradox, we need to examine the concepts of countability, uncountability, and how they are treated in set theory. In standard set theory, a set is considered countable if its elements can be put into a one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers, meaning the set can be listed or ordered in a sequence. A set is uncountable if this is not possible, such as the set of real numbers. The set of real numbers is uncountable because, intuitively, there are too many real numbers between any two given numbers to list them all in a sequence. This distinction between countable and uncountable sets is crucial in mathematics and logic. The real numbers, often symbolized as our \math, are one of the classic examples of an uncountable set. By contrast, the set of natural numbers n\math and is countable, as is any set that can be matched with the natural numbers. The idea that some sets are uncountable is an important part of modern set theory, forming the basis for many concepts in analysis, topology, and other branches of mathematics. However, Skolem's paradox challenges this understanding by showing that it is possible to have a model of set theory in which an uncountable set appears to be countable. This is technically legal under certain conditions in logic, but it feels deeply counterintuitive, as it contradicts our ordinary understanding of countability. To understand why this happens, we need to consider the role of models in set theory. In logic, a model is a mathematical structure that satisfies a given set of axioms. For instance, Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, ZF, which is one of the most widely used foundations of set theory, provides a set of axioms that describe how sets behave. A model of ZF set theory is a specific interpretation of those axioms that satisfies the rules of ZF. The problem comes into play when we consider the idea of countable models. A countable model is one in which the domain of the model, the collection of objects that the model refers to, is itself countable. This means the model contains a set of elements that can be listed or put into a one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers. Now, the critical point is that even though a model may be countable, it can still include sets that are uncountable in some sense. This is where Skolem's paradox comes in. Skolem's paradox shows that even in a countable model of set theory, there can exist sets that, in the real or intended interpretation of the theory, are uncountable. This can happen because the countable model is, by definition, just one possible way of interpreting the set theory axioms. When we describe the set of real numbers or another uncountable set within this countable model, it is possible to describe this set as if it were countable, simply because the model itself is countable and it cannot see the true uncountability of the set. The elements of this uncountable set are represented by elements of the countable model, but there is no way to actually list all of the elements in the model's domain. The paradox emerges because, in standard interpretations of set theory, uncountable sets are supposed to exist in a way that is fundamentally different from countable sets. The idea that a countable model can represent an uncountable set goes against the intuition that the size of a set is a concrete property. If a set is uncountable, it should not be possible to find a countable model that represents it as countable. Yet, Skolem's paradox shows that this is indeed possible under certain conditions in formal logic. To grasp this, consider the set of real numbers once again. In the standard, real world, the real numbers form an uncountable set, and there is no way to list them all. However, in a countable model of set theory, the real numbers might be represented by a set that is effectively countable within the model, even though it corresponds to the uncountable real numbers in the broader mathematical universe. In this model, the real numbers might seem to behave in every way like a countable set, even though in the actual universe of sets they are uncountable. This leads to an unsettling realization. The very notions of countable and uncountable become relative to the model in which they are interpreted. What appears to be an uncountable set in one model can be perceived as countable in another. The paradox underscores the importance of the specific model being used and how different models can lead to different conclusions about the size and structure of sets. One way to think about this is by considering the difference between absolute truths and truths that depend on the model. In the context of Skolem's paradox, the concept of uncountability is not absolute. It depends on the model you are using. While in standard set theory, the real numbers are uncountable, in a countable model, they may appear to be countable. The paradox highlights the fact that some truths in set theory are model-dependent, and this can lead to surprising and counterintuitive conclusions. Skolem's paradox is often seen as a challenge to our basic understanding of set theory and the nature of mathematical truth. It shows that the way we think about the size and structure of sets can be influenced by the formal systems we use to describe them. This realization can be deeply unsettling, as it calls into question the objectivity of mathematical truth. If two different models can lead to conflicting conclusions about the size of a set, what does this say about the nature of mathematical reality? Are there really objective truths in mathematics? Or are all mathematical truths merely products of the systems we choose to work within? Despite the discomfort it causes, Skolem's paradox is an important part of the development of mathematical logic and set theory. It teaches us that mathematical truth is not always as simple or absolute as we might like it to be. It reveals that the foundations of set theory and other areas of mathematics are more subtle and complex than they may appear at first glance. In doing so, it forces us to reconsider what we mean by countable and uncountable, and how we understand the very nature of mathematical existence. In summary, Skolem's paradox presents a challenge to our understanding of mathematical logic by showing that it is possible to have a countable model that represents uncountable sets. While this is technically legal within formal logic, it feels counterintuitive because it contradicts our ordinary conception of countability. The paradox underscores the model dependence of mathematical truth and forces us to reconsider the foundations of set theory and the nature of mathematical reality itself. Yablo's paradox is a self-referential paradox that challenges our understanding of truth and falsity without relying on traditional self-reference or loops. It is constructed using an infinite list of statements, each of which says that all the statements after it are false. While it avoids the usual pitfalls of self-reference and paradoxical loops, it still manages to break logic in a way that defies our expectations. This paradox provides a unique insight into how truth values can interact in unexpected ways. The structure of Yablo's paradox is simple, yet its implications are deep. It starts with a sequence of statements, where each statement in the list claims that every statement that follows it is false. To illustrate, consider an infinite list where the first statement is, all the statements after this one are false. The second statement then says, all the statements after this one are false. This pattern continues indefinitely, with each statement claiming that the remaining ones are false. There are no direct references to the truth or falsity of any particular statement within the list, and there are no loops where a statement refers back to itself. At first glance, this setup may seem harmless. After all, it looks like we are simply listing a series of statements that declare other statements to be false. But the paradox emerges when we try to determine the truth value of these statements. Let's take a closer look at the first statement. All the statements after this one are false. If this statement is true, then every statement that follows it must be false. This means that the second statement, which says, all the statements after this one are false, must also be false. But if the second statement is false, that means not all the statements after it are false, which implies that at least one of the statements after the second statement must be true. This creates a contradiction. If the second statement is false, we end up with a situation where one of the following statements must be true, but the second statement itself claims that all the following statements are false. This leads us to a situation where we cannot consistently assign truth values to the statements without encountering contradictions. The problem becomes even more apparent when we extend the list to an infinite number of statements. Each statement in the list is dependent on the truth value of all the statements that follow it, creating a complex web of truth and falsity. If we assume that the first statement is true, then we are forced to conclude that every subsequent statement must be false. But this then forces us into a contradiction, as we would expect one of the later statements to be true, which undermines the assumption that the first statement is true. On the other hand, if we assume that the first statement is false, then we are claiming that not all the statements after it are false. This means that at least one of the statements following the first must be true. But which statement is true, and how can we determine that? The paradox reveals that neither assuming the first statement is true nor assuming it is false leads to a consistent interpretation of the sequence of statements. The lack of self-reference or loops does not prevent the paradox from breaking down our conventional understanding of truth in a sequence of statements. Yablo's paradox highlights a key issue in logic and philosophy. How can truth and falsity work when they depend on an infinite sequence of statements that refer to each other indirectly? In more traditional logical paradoxes, such as the liar paradox, a statement refers back to itself, creating a direct loop of truth and falsity. Yablo's paradox, however, does not rely on self-reference or loops in the usual sense. Each statement in the list refers to all the statements that come after it, but there is no direct reference to itself. Despite this, the paradox still manages to break our usual understanding of how truth works in logical systems. The impact of Yablo's paradox is profound because it shows that infinite sequences of statements, even without direct self-reference, can still create logical inconsistencies. It forces us to reconsider how we handle truth in contexts where statements are interdependent, especially when those statements form an infinite series. If an infinite sequence of statements can break logic in this way, what does this say about the nature of truth itself? Is truth a stable, consistent property? Or is it something that can be disrupted by the structure of a system? The paradox also has implications for how we think about formal systems in mathematics and logic. In formal logic, we rely on consistent rules for determining the truth or falsity of statements. Yablo's paradox challenges this by showing that even simple statements, when structured in an infinite sequence, can lead to contradictions without any direct self-reference. It suggests that there may be limits to the kinds of systems we can construct without running into paradoxes, and that infinity itself introduces challenges that cannot be easily resolved by our usual logical tools. Another interesting aspect of Yablo's paradox is its connection to other logical and philosophical problems. It bears some resemblance to the well-known liar paradox, in which a statement like, "This statement is false," leads to a contradiction. However, unlike the liar paradox, which depends on self-reference, Yablo's paradox relies on the interaction between statements in an infinite sequence. This shows that the issue of truth and falsity is not just about self-reference, but about the structure and interdependence of statements in a logical system. In conclusion, Yablo's paradox is a fascinating and unsettling paradox that challenges our understanding of truth and falsity in logical systems. By presenting an infinite sequence of statements, each claiming that all the statements after it are false, Yablo creates a situation where neither assuming the truth nor assuming the falsity of the first statement leads to a consistent interpretation of the entire sequence. The paradox shows that infinity itself can lead to logical breakdowns, even without the direct self-reference or loops seen in other paradoxes. It forces us to reconsider the nature of truth and the limitations of formal systems, and it opens up new avenues for exploring the complexity of logical structures. The Teletransportation Paradox is a thought experiment that questions the nature of identity, consciousness, and personal continuity. It imagines a scenario where a machine can copy every atom of your body, effectively creating a perfect replica of you in a different location. The paradox lies in whether this copying process genuinely transports you to the new location or if, in the process, the original version of you dies and is replaced by a new, identical version. At the heart of the paradox is the question of what it means to be you. If the teletransportation machine operates by scanning your body atom by atom and recreating an exact copy of you somewhere else, does this process preserve your personal identity? Or does it simply destroy the original version of you, leaving a new, identical person in the new location? This dilemma touches on several philosophical and metaphysical issues, particularly related to the nature of consciousness, identity, and the mind. To illustrate the problem, let's first consider a simplified version of the teletransportation process. Imagine a machine that scans your body and records every detail, down to the atomic level. It then transmits this information to another machine at a distant location, which reconstructs your body using the same atoms and molecules. The result is a perfect replica of you in every way. Your thoughts, memories, and experiences are preserved, as well as your physical form. The replica wakes up in a new place, seemingly identical to the original you, but the original body is destroyed in the process. The replica may even believe it is the same person, with the same consciousness and memories. The problem comes when we ask whether the replica is actually you. On one hand, the replica seems to be you. It has all of your memories, experiences, and physical characteristics. It may even feel like it is the same person with the same consciousness. But from another perspective, the original you has been destroyed. If the machine copied every atom of your body and created a new version of you, does this mean the original self is gone? Is the replica simply a new person with no connection to the original you? This raises several philosophical questions. First, is identity based on the physical continuity of the body? Or is it based on the continuity of consciousness? If identity depends on the body, then the destruction of the original body would mean that you are no longer the same person. In this view, the replica would be a different person, even though it appears identical in every way. On the other hand, if identity depends on the continuity of consciousness, then the replica would be you because it has the same thoughts, memories, and experiences as the original. But this perspective raises another issue. Does the machine actually transfer your consciousness, or does it simply create a copy of it? The teletransportation paradox is often compared to the idea of copying a file on a computer. When you copy a file, the original remains intact, and a new, identical file is created. But in the case of a person, the situation is more complex. You cannot simply make a copy of a person in the same way you copy a file. The original person's consciousness is tied to the specific arrangement of atoms in their brain, and when the body is destroyed, it's unclear what happens to that consciousness. Is the replica truly the same person, or is it simply a copy with no real continuity of self? One possible way to resolve this paradox is to argue that the replica is you because it has the same memories and experiences. According to this view, identity is not tied to the original body but to the mental continuity of the person. The replica, having the same thoughts and memories, would be the same person even though it is technically a new body. This perspective aligns with certain philosophical views that emphasize the mind over the body in defining personal identity. In this case, the machine would not be killing you but rather transferring your consciousness to a new body, much like a computer program being transferred from one machine to another. However, there are problems with this solution as well. If the replica is truly you, what happens to the original self that was destroyed? Did the original you simply die? And is the replica merely a new person with no direct connection to the original? Some philosophers argue that the original self is indeed gone, and the replica is not the same person, even though it may believe itself to be. In this view, the machine does not transport you. It simply creates a new version of you that is indistinguishable from the original, but it does not preserve the continuity of the original person's life. This issue is further complicated by the nature of consciousness itself. What does it mean for consciousness to be transferred? If consciousness is the result of the specific arrangement of atoms in the brain, then copying the brain would not preserve the original consciousness but merely create a new, identical consciousness. In this case, the replica would be a new person with no connection to the original. If, on the other hand, consciousness is something that can be separated from the physical body and transferred to another form, then the replica could be considered the same person. But this raises even deeper questions about the nature of consciousness. Can it really be transferred in the way the teletransportation machine suggests? The paradox also brings up the issue of personal survival. If the original person is destroyed, is it possible for them to survive the process? Survival typically involves the continuation of one's life, but if the original self is gone and replaced by a copy, can we still say that the person has survived the process? From a physical perspective, survival requires the continuation of the original body and consciousness. But in the case of teletransportation, the continuity of consciousness is disrupted, and the original self is lost. The paradox challenges our assumptions about what it means to survive and whether survival is possible when one's body and consciousness are destroyed and replaced by an identical replica. There are other variations of the teletransportation paradox that further complicate these issues. For example, imagine that the machine does not destroy the original body but instead creates a duplicate while leaving the original intact. In this case, both the original person and the replica exist, each with the same memories and consciousness. Which one is the real person? Are they both the same person, or is one of them a mere copy? This version of the paradox forces us to confront the problem of identity even more directly, as we now have two individuals who both believe they are the same person. In conclusion, the teletransportation paradox presents a deep and unsettling challenge to our understanding of personal identity, consciousness, and survival. It forces us to consider whether identity is based on the physical body, the continuity of consciousness, or something else entirely. The paradox also raises difficult questions about the nature of death and whether it is possible to preserve one's identity when the original body is destroyed and replaced by a copy. As a thought experiment, it encourages us to think more carefully about what it means to be you and how we might define personal continuity in a world where technology could one day make such mind-bending scenarios a reality. Russell's paradox is a famous problem in set theory that challenges the foundation of mathematics itself. It raises an important question about the nature of sets, particularly when we ask if there can be a set of all sets that do not contain themselves. The paradox is named after Bertrand Russell, who discovered it in 1901. He found that the seemingly straightforward idea of sets leads to a contradiction that undermines much of the logic used in set theory. To understand the paradox, let's first look at the concept of a set. In simple terms, a set is a collection of objects. For example, you might have a set of numbers, a set of books, or a set of people. These objects, called elements, can be anything. In the standard understanding of set theory, we assume that for any collection of objects, there exists a set that contains them. Now, let's focus on the idea of a set of all sets that do not contain themselves. This idea is at the heart of Russell's paradox. We begin by asking, is there a set that contains all the sets that do not contain themselves? This leads to the key question of the paradox. Does this set contain itself? Let's walk through the logic behind this question. Assume such a set exists, and let's call it S. According to its definition, S contains all the sets that do not contain themselves. But now we need to ask whether S contains itself. If S contains itself, then by the definition of the set, it should not contain itself because it only contains sets that do not contain themselves. This creates a contradiction. If S contains itself, it must not contain itself. On the other hand, if S does not contain itself, then by its own definition, it must contain itself. After all, S is a set that contains all sets that do not contain themselves, and since it doesn't contain itself, it must be included in the set. Again, we run into a contradiction. If S does not contain itself, then it must contain itself. This creates an irresolvable problem. We cannot consistently answer whether the set S contains itself or not, which means the idea of a set of all sets that do not contain themselves leads to a logical paradox. This paradox challenges the assumption that sets can always be formed in a straightforward way according to their defining properties. The implications of Russell's paradox are far-reaching. It shows that the foundations of set theory, once thought to be logically solid, are actually inconsistent. In fact, the paradox demonstrates that our naive conception of sets leads to contradictions. The paradox also reveals that we need to rethink how we define sets and what kinds of collections are allowed in set theory. Before Russell's paradox, mathematicians like George Cantor had developed a framework of set theory that appeared to be free from contradictions. Cantor's work on infinite sets, particularly his discovery of different sizes of infinity, revolutionized mathematics. However, the assumption that any collection of objects can form a set turned out to be flawed, as shown by Russell's paradox. Russell's paradox also highlighted a deep problem in the way logic and mathematics were understood at the time. The paradox demonstrated that certain kinds of collections, like the set of all sets that do not contain themselves, cannot exist without causing contradictions. This was a serious problem because it seemed to undermine the very basis of set theory and, by extension, much of mathematics. One of the key issues raised by the paradox is the idea of self-reference. In the case of the set S, the question of whether it contains itself leads to a situation where the set is both defined by and refers to itself. This kind of self-reference is what leads to the paradox, as it creates a loop where the set both must and must not contain itself. This self-referential structure is what makes the paradox so tricky. To resolve the paradox, mathematicians had to rethink the foundations of set theory. The solution came with the development of more formal systems that avoided the unrestricted creation of sets. One approach to solving the paradox was proposed by Kurt Gödel and others, who developed the theory of types. The theory of types placed restrictions on how sets could be formed, ensuring that no set could contain itself as an element. This eliminated the possibility of forming the problematic set of all sets that do not contain themselves. The theory of types worked by organizing sets into different levels or types. A set of type 1 could only contain sets of type 0, and a set of type 2 could only contain sets of type 0 or 1, and so on. This hierarchical structure prevented sets from containing themselves, which effectively resolved the paradox. In this system, a set that would otherwise lead to a contradiction could no longer be formed. Another approach to resolving Russell's paradox came with the development of Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, often abbreviated as ZF. This theory provides a more careful and precise definition of what constitutes a set. ZF set theory places strict rules on the construction of sets, eliminating the possibility of forming a set like the one involved in Russell's paradox. The key feature of ZF set theory is the axiom of regularity, which ensures that no set can be a member of itself, thus preventing paradoxes like Russell's from arising. Despite these solutions, the legacy of Russell's paradox remains important in the study of logic and philosophy. The paradox demonstrated that our intuitions about sets and collections are not always reliable. It forced mathematicians to develop more formal, rigorous systems of logic that could avoid such contradictions. The paradox also raised broader questions about the nature of logic, language, and self-reference. It showed that even seemingly innocent ideas, like the set of all sets, could lead to deep and difficult problems. Russell's paradox is not just a technical issue in set theory. It is a philosophical issue that touches on questions about how we understand language, meaning, and truth. The paradox forces us to confront the limits of our logical systems and challenges the way we think about the nature of mathematical objects. In this sense, it is more than just a technical puzzle. It is a reminder of the complexities and pitfalls of formal reasoning. In summary, Russell's paradox demonstrates that there are limits to the kinds of sets we can form without encountering logical contradictions. The paradox arises from the question of whether a set that contains all sets that do not contain themselves can contain itself. This leads to a contradiction, as the set both must and must not contain itself. The paradox highlighted the need for a more formal, structured approach to set theory, which eventually led to the development of systems like the theory of types and Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory. Despite these resolutions, the paradox remains a foundational challenge in logic and mathematics, raising important questions about the nature of sets, self-reference, and the limits of formal systems. You spent weeks on the project. You stayed late, did the research, built the presentation, and solved the hard problems. You checked every detail twice before sending it in. Then came the meeting. Your boss stood up and walked through the entire thing, your slides, your insights, your words. But they didn't mention your name. Not once. They made it sound like the work was theirs. People nodded, impressed. Some even praised them afterward. You sat there, invisible. At first, you might tell yourself it doesn't matter. The team knows you did the work. Or maybe they don't. Maybe they think you helped a little, but that your boss led it. The story is already out there. And now you're stuck with a decision. Do you confront your boss and risk tension? Or stay silent and let it go? Before deciding, think about why it happened. Was it intentional? Some bosses genuinely forget to give credit. They're moving fast, focused on delivery, and miss the details. In other cases, it's a pattern. They take credit often. They present others' work as their own to climb higher. Knowing which kind of boss you're dealing with changes how you respond. If it's the first time, start by talking to them directly. You don't accuse. You stay calm. You say, I noticed in the meeting my name wasn't mentioned when the project was discussed. I'd appreciate being recognized for the work I contributed. That's not confrontation. That's clarity. It gives them a chance to fix it. Maybe they say, you're right. I should have said something. Or they downplay it. It's a team effort, and I was presenting for all of us. That's where you pay attention. If they're defensive or dismissive, it tells you they don't plan to change. But if they're open and correct the record, even privately, then the relationship may still work. Recognition matters, not because you need applause, but because it sets a tone. If your work is always absorbed into someone else's spotlight, your reputation stays small. Promotions, raises, and respect depend on visibility. Without it, you're overlooked. Let's say the pattern continues. Your boss regularly takes credit. You lead a project and they send an update to leadership using your work, but with their name. They call your solution something the team worked on without naming you. Over time, this wears you down. You feel used. You stop sharing ideas freely. You start thinking, what's the point? In that situation, silence only protects the boss. It doesn't protect you. But confrontation doesn't mean shouting or ultimatums. It means building a case. Document your work. Keep copies of emails, drafts, feedback. Make a habit of summarizing key steps and sending updates that include your name. Here's the final version I prepared based on our last discussion. That creates a paper trail. It's not aggressive. It's professional. Next, find ways to make your work visible. When you present, claim your space. Don't say, I helped with this. Say, I developed the proposal after reviewing the data. When someone praises your boss for something you did, follow up politely. Thanks, yes, that part came from the research I did last month. You don't brag. You state facts. If things don't improve, you may need support. A trusted mentor, a colleague who's seen your work, or even HR. This isn't about revenge. It's about fairness. If leadership thinks your boss is producing work they didn't do, that skews decisions. It keeps the wrong person in power and leaves the real contributors in the dark. There's also the option of stepping back and reassessing. Ask yourself, is this the kind of place I want to grow in? If credit is always filtered through someone else, if your voice isn't valued, then it may be time to look elsewhere. Not out of anger, but out of self-respect. Some people will say it's not worth the trouble, that rocking the boat will only make things harder. But there's a cost to staying quiet. It's not just about this one project. It's about your future. If you let others take your credit without pushback, you teach them that it's okay. And each time it gets harder to speak up. You can be calm and assertive at the same time. You don't have to choose between silence and conflict. There's a middle path, clear, direct communication backed by your record. When your boss takes credit, you don't have to sit in silence. You speak once, then again if needed. You build allies. You stay professional, but you don't disappear. Over time, people notice who really delivers. And when they do, you want your name to be there, not hidden behind someone else's. Your work speaks, but only if you let it be heard. The paradox of tolerance presents a compelling challenge to the concept of limitless tolerance. It suggests that, in order to preserve a tolerant society, we must sometimes be intolerant toward those who promote intolerance. This paradox, first introduced by philosopher Karl Popper in 1945, forces us to confront the limits of tolerance itself. If we are tolerant to all ideas, including intolerant ones, we risk enabling the very forces that seek to destroy tolerance. The paradox begins with the basic idea that tolerance is a virtue. A tolerant society is one where individuals and groups respect each other's differences, allowing for a diversity of opinions, beliefs, and lifestyles. Tolerance in this sense is often seen as a cornerstone of democratic societies. It provides the foundation for peaceful coexistence and encourages open dialogue between people of differing views. Without tolerance, social harmony is difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. However, the paradox arises when tolerance is extended to those who are themselves intolerant. This creates a contradiction. If we tolerate the intolerant, we risk undermining the very values that make tolerance possible. Take, for instance, a group that advocates for the suppression of certain rights or freedoms, such as freedom of speech or equality. If a tolerant society allows such views to thrive without challenge, it can result in the erosion of tolerance itself. In this way, a society that tolerates everything, including harmful ideologies, may eventually lose its ability to maintain the principles of freedom and respect that tolerance was supposed to protect. This paradox is most easily understood in the context of extremist or authoritarian ideologies. In a democratic society, individuals are generally free to express their views, even if those views are unpopular or controversial. However, when individuals or groups espouse ideas that advocate for the oppression of others, such as racism, sexism, or xenophobia, the tolerance of such views poses a problem. If society tolerates these views in the name of free speech or inclusivity, it could inadvertently pave the way for the very forces that seek to undermine democracy and individual freedoms. Popper's argument is that we must be intolerant of such intolerance to preserve the values of an open society. This paradox is not just a theoretical concern. It is a practical issue that societies face every day. Consider, for example, the rise of hate speech and hate groups. Many countries have laws protecting freedom of expression, which means that individuals are free to express their opinions, even if those opinions are offensive or discriminatory. However, when hate speech crosses a line and incites violence or discrimination against specific groups, it becomes a threat to the values of equality and mutual respect. In such cases, if society does not take action to curb hate speech, it risks allowing intolerance to spread unchecked. The challenge is finding the balance between protecting freedom of speech and preventing the spread of harmful ideologies. If we allow intolerant views to flourish in the name of free speech, we may inadvertently allow those views to undermine the very freedoms that enable open dialogue and the exchange of ideas. On the other hand, if we clamp down on intolerance too harshly, we risk infringing upon individuals' rights to express their views. The paradox of tolerance forces us to grapple with this tension and ask where the line should be drawn. One of the key elements of the paradox is the idea that tolerance is not a passive quality. It requires action and vigilance. A tolerant society does not simply allow all ideas to coexist without challenge. It actively protects itself from ideas that seek to destroy the freedoms and respect that make tolerance possible. This active defense of tolerance is what makes the paradox so difficult to resolve. In a society that values open discourse, it is essential to allow for a wide range of ideas. But at the same time, it is equally important to protect the society from ideas that pose a direct threat to its foundational principles. This paradox is particularly relevant in modern times, where globalization and the spread of social media have made it easier for extremist ideologies to gain traction. The internet allows individuals to share their views with a global audience, and while this can be a force for positive change, it also means that harmful ideologies can spread more quickly and widely than ever before. In this context, the paradox of tolerance becomes even more pressing. How can we ensure that a tolerant society does not allow itself to be overtaken by intolerance, especially in an era where harmful ideas can spread so rapidly? The paradox also brings up questions about the nature of tolerance itself. What does it mean to be truly tolerant? Does tolerance mean accepting all ideas, no matter how harmful they may be? Or does it mean fostering an environment where individuals can disagree without resorting to violence or oppression? True tolerance, in this sense, may not be about passive acceptance of all ideas, but rather about the active creation of a space where ideas can be debated and discussed in a way that respects the dignity and rights of others. This kind of tolerance is not about allowing harmful ideologies to spread unchecked, but about ensuring that diverse perspectives can coexist in a way that promotes understanding and mutual respect. In some ways, the paradox of tolerance can be seen as a reflection of the broader tension between freedom and responsibility. A society that values freedom must also recognize the responsibility that comes with it. The freedom to express ideas comes with the responsibility to ensure that those ideas do not harm others or infringe upon their rights. In this sense, tolerance is not just about allowing people to say whatever they want. It is about creating a framework where ideas can be expressed, but within the boundaries of respect for others' rights and freedoms. This concept also has important implications for the way we handle political discourse. In democratic societies, political discourse is essential for the functioning of the government and the shaping of public policy. But if political discourse becomes dominated by intolerant ideologies, it can undermine the democratic process itself. The paradox of tolerance asks us to consider how we can preserve the integrity of democratic institutions while still allowing for a diversity of viewpoints. It challenges us to think about the limits of tolerance and how to protect the values that make democracy and freedom possible. In the end, the paradox of tolerance forces us to ask fundamental questions about how we navigate the complexities of freedom and respect in a diverse society. It challenges us to recognize that tolerance is not a simple, passive acceptance of all ideas, but an active defense of the principles that allow for a free and open society. To stay tolerant, we must be intolerant of intolerance, ensuring that the forces that seek to undermine the values of equality, freedom, and respect are kept in check. In this way, tolerance is not just about what we accept, it is about what we actively protect. Thomson's lamp is a thought experiment that raises a paradox about time, infinity, and the nature of change. The problem presents a situation where a lamp is flipped on and off infinitely fast within 1 minute. The key question is, when the minute ends, is the lamp on or off? To understand the paradox, let's break it down step by step. Imagine you start with a lamp in the off position. At time 0, you flip the lamp on. At time 1/2, half a second, you flip it off. At time 1/4, a quarter of a second, you flip it on again. At time January 8th, you flip it off. You continue flipping the lamp on and off at having intervals, infinitely many times, within the span of 1 minute. Now, the question is, when the time reaches 1 minute, is the lamp on or off? You might initially think that after a finite number of flips, there would be a clear answer. But because the flips occur infinitely fast within the 1-minute period, the situation becomes far more complicated. To explain this, consider the fact that the lamp is being flipped at an increasingly rapid pace. The first flip happens after 1 second, the second after 1/2 second, the third after 1/4 second, and so on. The total amount of time it takes to perform all of these flips is the sum of the intervals. 1 plus 1/2 plus 1/4 plus 1/8 plus, and so on. This is an infinite series, but it's a special kind of series called a geometric series. The sum of this series is finite. In fact, it adds up to 2. This means that, despite the infinite number of flips, all the actions are completed in 2 seconds. However, since we are flipping the lamp in intervals that decrease infinitely, the total time to complete the flips never exceeds 1 minute. So, if we look at the total number of flips and how rapidly they occur, you might think that after the infinite sequence of flips, the lamp would be either in the on or off state based on a final flip. But because the flips are performed at an infinite rate, determining the final state becomes elusive. There is no last flip. You can't say that the lamp is on because there is no final on flip. Similarly, you can't say it's off because there is no final off flip. In this sense, the final state of the lamp is ambiguous. The paradox arises from the fact that even though the total time is finite, the number of actions, the flips, is infinite. This creates a situation where, logically, the state of the lamp should be determined by the last flip, but because there is no last flip in an infinite sequence, we are left with a paradox. In other words, the system of flipping the lamp leads to an indeterminate state after the infinite sequence of actions is completed. To think of it another way, imagine you're walking toward a door, and with each step you have the distance between you and the door. You'll never reach the door, but you'll get infinitely close to it. Similarly, in Thomson's lamp, the number of flips approaches infinity, but you never reach a definitive moment when the final flip occurs. This thought experiment challenges our understanding of time and the limits of infinity. We expect actions that happen within a finite period of time to result in a clear outcome, but with infinite actions occurring within that time, the result becomes undefined. It forces us to confront the limits of our intuition about the physical world when it comes to infinity. We understand time as a linear progression, where events happen one after another, but in the case of infinite actions in a finite time, the usual way we think about the flow of time breaks down. Thomson's lamp is often used as a way to illustrate some of the strange paradoxes that arise from considering infinite processes. It also brings up important questions about the nature of infinity itself. For example, what does it mean for something to happen infinitely fast? How do we reconcile this with our ordinary experiences of time and change? And if we cannot make sense of processes that involve infinite steps, does that mean we need to rethink how we apply infinity in both mathematics and physics? Moreover, this paradox also taps into deeper questions about how we define states of being or conditions. In Thomson's lamp, the on and off states are treated as if they are fixed, discrete states that can be determined after a finite sequence of actions. But in the case of infinite steps, these states become slippery and difficult to define. This has implications for other paradoxes and problems in physics, where infinity often arises in the form of infinitely small or large quantities. In the context of modern physics, questions like Thomson's lamp are important for understanding the limits of physical theories that involve continuous time or infinite processes. In the real world, we rarely encounter true infinities, but models of space, time, and motion often involve infinite processes or limits that approach infinity. Thomson's lamp helps us think about the challenges of applying these abstract concepts to real-world situations. The paradox also highlights the tension between mathematical models and the physical world. In mathematics, we are comfortable with dealing with infinite processes in the abstract. But when we try to apply them to physical systems, we run into questions about how infinity interacts with finite time and space. In reality, of course, no process can occur infinitely fast. But Thomson's lamp forces us to think about what happens when we imagine such a process, highlighting the limitations of our mathematical models in capturing the complexity of real-world time and events. In conclusion, Thomson's lamp presents an intriguing paradox that forces us to reconsider our assumptions about time, infinity, and change. The idea of flipping a lamp infinitely fast within a finite amount of time seems paradoxical because it challenges our normal way of thinking about how actions unfold and lead to outcomes. The paradox of the lamp, whether it is on or off after an infinite series of flips, reminds us that infinite processes do not always lead to clear, deterministic outcomes. Instead, they can present us with situations where the normal rules of logic and causality break down, forcing us to rethink how we understand time and change. The Fermi Paradox is a perplexing question that has puzzled scientists, philosophers, and thinkers for decades. If the universe is so vast, with billions of stars and potentially habitable planets, why haven't we found any evidence of extraterrestrial life? Statistically, intelligent alien civilizations should exist, and some may even be technologically advanced enough to have traveled across the galaxy by now. So where are they? The paradox takes its name from physicist Enrico Fermi, who famously asked, "Where is everybody?" during a casual conversation in 1950. He was reflecting on the high probability of extraterrestrial life existing, given the sheer number of stars and planets in the Milky Way galaxy alone. If civilizations were common, Fermi reasoned, it seemed odd that we had not yet detected any signs of their existence. The Fermi paradox is grounded in basic statistics. The Milky Way alone contains over 100 billion stars, and many of those stars are orbited by planets. Some of those planets are in the habitable zone, where conditions might be right for life to develop, meaning liquid water could exist. Given the vast number of stars and planets, it seems likely that life should have emerged elsewhere in the galaxy at least once, and some of those civilizations should have become technologically advanced enough to reach out to or even visit us. Yet, despite the seemingly high odds of extraterrestrial life, we found no direct evidence of aliens, no signals, no visits, no clear signs of advanced technology. No one has made contact with us. The paradox is the gap between the high probability of alien civilizations existing and the complete lack of evidence or communication from them. To understand why this is such a puzzle, let's explore the idea of a typical alien civilization's potential. Suppose a civilization evolves on a planet similar to Earth and advances to the point of mastering space travel. Given enough time, such a civilization could colonize the galaxy, or at least explore it by sending probes or communications. Even if a civilization was not able to travel at the speed of light, the sheer size of the universe suggests that they would have plenty of time to spread out across the galaxy, perhaps even colonizing distant star systems over millions of years. So, logically, if alien civilizations exist, they should have had plenty of opportunities to contact us, or at least leave traces of their existence. This leads to a few potential explanations for why we haven't found any evidence of extraterrestrial life. One possibility is that alien civilizations are simply too far away. The distances between stars are vast, and even with advanced technology, it could take centuries or millennia to travel between them. If alien civilizations exist, they might be so far away that their signals haven't reached us yet, or they haven't detected us either. This explanation suggests that the universe is simply too large, and we may not have the right technology to detect them or vice versa. Another possibility is that advanced civilizations tend to self-destruct before they can communicate with or visit other civilizations. This idea stems from the fact that many advanced civilizations in human history have faced existential risks, such as war, environmental destruction, or resource depletion. A technological civilization might be capable of self-destruction long before it can reach the point of colonizing other planets. If this happens frequently, then civilizations might rarely have the time to reach out to others before they destroy themselves. A more disturbing possibility is that advanced civilizations may choose not to contact us. There could be a galactic quarantine in place, where alien civilizations deliberately avoid contact with less advanced civilizations like ours. This idea suggests that advanced civilizations might intentionally isolate themselves from younger civilizations to prevent cultural contamination, resource exploitation, or conflict. If such a policy exists, it would mean that alien civilizations are aware of us but have chosen to remain silent. There's also the idea that we might be looking for the wrong kind of signals. We are currently searching for radio signals, optical signals, and other forms of communication that resemble what we use to communicate with each other. But alien civilizations might use entirely different forms of communication that we don't yet understand or can't detect with current technology. Perhaps they are using forms of communication beyond the electromagnetic spectrum, like quantum entanglement, or perhaps they've mastered forms of communication that are undetectable to us. Alternatively, it's possible that extraterrestrial civilizations are out there, but they are simply not interested in us. Our own species has explored only a tiny fraction of Earth's biosphere and has little interest in reaching out to all other species, especially those that are less developed than we are. An alien civilization might look at Earth and decide that we are too primitive or insignificant to warrant attention. They might have already seen millions of other planets with life and simply have no reason to contact us. Another potential explanation is that extraterrestrial life exists, but it is rare or difficult to detect. We might be in the middle of a great filter, where life is very common, but the emergence of intelligent life capable of communication or space travel is exceedingly rare. The Great Filter hypothesis suggests that while simple life forms may exist in abundance, the step from simple life to advanced, communicative civilizations is a significant bottleneck. It could be that life evolves on many planets, but the leap to advanced intelligence is so difficult that most civilizations never make it. The idea of the zoo hypothesis offers another possibility. This hypothesis posits that alien civilizations might be aware of us but are intentionally keeping us in isolation, like animals in a zoo. They might observe us from a distance, studying our development, but choose not to interfere. This would explain why we haven't detected any signals or made contact with aliens. They're deliberately hiding themselves, waiting for us to reach a certain level of development before engaging with us. Lastly, we must consider the possibility that extraterrestrial civilizations simply don't exist. It's possible that, despite the high probability suggested by statistics, we are truly alone in the universe. Perhaps Earth is an anomaly, or perhaps life is much rarer than we think. While this is a bleak thought, it's important to acknowledge that we currently have no direct evidence of life beyond Earth, and the absence of evidence is a crucial part of the paradox. The Fermi Paradox forces us to confront deep questions about our place in the universe. If intelligent life is common, why haven't we found evidence of it? Is Earth alone in the vast expanse of space, or is there something else at play? Something that we haven't yet discovered or fully understood? The paradox remains an open question, and it continues to inspire debate, research, and new theories in the search for extraterrestrial life. The Preface Paradox arises when an author believes that every chapter of their book is true, but simultaneously acknowledges that the book might contain errors. This situation seems logical at first, but it creates a paradox when we try to resolve the apparent contradiction between the author's confidence in the truth of individual chapters and their admission that errors might be present in the book as a whole. To understand the paradox more clearly, let's break it down. Suppose an author writes a book and believes that each individual chapter presents true information. This belief in the truth of the chapters is grounded in the author's own understanding, research, and careful consideration. The author feels confident about the accuracy of each part of the book. However, the author also includes a preface where they admit that there might be errors in the book, perhaps due to oversights, misjudgments, or limitations in their research. This acknowledgement is a common practice in many works of nonfiction, as authors recognize the fallibility of human knowledge and the potential for mistakes. At first glance, this admission seems reasonable. After all, any piece of work, no matter how well-researched or well-written, can contain errors. No one is perfect, and even the most diligent authors can miss details or make mistakes. The paradox, however, arises when we try to reconcile the author's belief that each chapter is true with their admission that the book might contain errors. If the author truly believes every chapter is true, then how can they also believe that the book might contain errors? The two statements seem to be in conflict with each other. Let's consider this scenario with a concrete example. Imagine an author writing a historical account of a particular event. The author believes that every chapter accurately presents the facts and that the interpretations are sound. However, in the preface, the author states that, while they believe in the truth of the content, they acknowledge the possibility that they might have overlooked certain details or made mistakes. Perhaps a fact is misrepresented, or a conclusion might be incorrect. The author does not assert that the book is full of errors, but rather that, given the complexity of the subject matter, there is always a chance that something may not be completely accurate. In this scenario, the paradox begins to emerge. The author is claiming that each chapter is true, yet the possibility of error implies that not everything in the book is guaranteed to be true. The problem is that if errors do exist in the book, then the chapters cannot be fully true, because a true chapter should be free from mistakes. The author's belief in the truth of each chapter is directly challenged by their acknowledgement of the possibility of error, creating a tension between these two statements. One way to think about this paradox is by considering the idea of self-contradiction. The author is essentially saying, I believe that everything I've written is true, but I also admit that there might be errors. The first part of this statement implies certainty, while the second part introduces doubt. How can something be both absolutely true and possibly flawed at the same time? This seems like a contradiction, and yet it's a contradiction that many authors willingly accept when writing a preface or introduction to their work. The paradox can also be explored through the concept of logical consistency. In logic, a statement is considered true if it is consistent with all other true statements. In this case, the author's belief that every chapter is true would suggest that there are no contradictions or errors within the chapters themselves. However, the admission that errors might exist in the book implies that there could be contradictions or inaccuracies in some part of the work, which undermines the claim of truth. In other words, the author's admission that errors are possible creates a situation where the claim of truth for each individual chapter cannot be entirely consistent with the acknowledgement of potential mistakes. Another way to approach this paradox is by considering the role of probability. The author might believe that each chapter is highly likely to be true, but that there is a small chance of error. This probabilistic approach introduces an element of uncertainty, suggesting that while the author is confident in the truth of the chapters, they also recognize that absolute certainty is impossible. This way of thinking may alleviate some of the tension between the two conflicting statements. However, even with this probabilistic mindset, the paradox still persists in a weaker form. If the author truly believes in the truth of each chapter, it seems contradictory for them to also believe that there is a chance of error in the book as a whole. The two beliefs, certainty and doubt, are still difficult to reconcile. The Preface Paradox also touches on deeper philosophical questions about truth and knowledge. What does it mean for something to be true? Is truth an absolute concept, or can it be understood in more relative terms? The author's admission that errors are possible suggests that truth is not absolute but subject to revision. This idea challenges the traditional view of truth as something fixed and unchanging. In this context, the paradox invites us to think more critically about the nature of truth, accuracy, and the limits of human knowledge. Even when an author is confident in the truth of their work, they must acknowledge the possibility of error because human understanding is inherently limited. In addition, the paradox highlights the tension between certainty and humility. The author's belief in the truth of each chapter represents confidence, while their admission of potential errors represents humility. This duality is common in intellectual work, where certainty and doubt coexist. Scholars often assert their ideas with conviction, but they also recognize the possibility of error and the need for ongoing inquiry. The Preface Paradox is a reminder that intellectual humility does not necessarily negate confidence in one's work. Instead, it reflects an understanding of the limits of knowledge and the importance of remaining open to revision and correction. The paradox also sheds light on the nature of intellectual honesty. By admitting that errors might exist in the book, the author demonstrates a willingness to be transparent about the limitations of their work. This admission is not a rejection of the truth of the chapters, but an acknowledgement that no work is beyond reproach. The paradox, in this sense, can be seen as a reflection of the ongoing process of intellectual growth. It reminds us that even when we believe we are correct, we must remain open to the possibility that we might be wrong. In real-world scenarios, this paradox is often seen in scientific writing, where researchers present their findings with confidence but also acknowledge the limitations of their studies. In scientific research, it is common to present hypotheses and conclusions based on available data, but to also admit that the results may be subject to revision as new evidence emerges. This balance between confidence and caution is essential in scientific inquiry, as it allows for the advancement of knowledge while maintaining intellectual integrity. Ultimately, the Preface Paradox challenges our understanding of truth, certainty, and knowledge. It asks us to reconcile the belief in the truth of individual statements with the recognition that errors are always possible. This paradox is not necessarily a problem to be solved, but a reflection of the complexities inherent in human knowledge and the pursuit of understanding. It forces us to confront the limitations of certainty and reminds us that even the most confident assertions are always subject to revision and correction. The Ship of Theseus is a philosophical thought experiment that explores the nature of identity, change, and continuity. The scenario is simple. Imagine you have a ship, and over time, every single part of the ship is replaced one by one. Eventually, the ship is completely rebuilt with new parts, and the original parts are discarded. The question is, after all these changes, is it still the same ship? On the surface, the answer seems obvious. After all, it's the same ship in terms of its form, function, and purpose. But the deeper we look into the nature of identity and what it means for something to remain the same, the more complex the problem becomes. To begin with, we can think about identity as something that depends on the physical components of an object. If you have a table, for example, its identity seems to be tied to its individual pieces, its legs, top, and so on. If you take away one leg and replace it, the table may still be considered the same table. If you replace all four legs, it might still feel like the same table. But if you replace every single part of the table, piece by piece, at what point does it stop being the same table and become a different object altogether? This brings us to the Ship of Theseus. The ship, in this case, is no different from the table, except that instead of just a few parts being replaced, every part of the ship is eventually replaced. The hull, the mast, the sails, and even the rudder, all of these are swapped out one piece at a time. After all the parts have been replaced, it looks identical to the original ship, but is it the same ship? One perspective is that the ship is still the same because it maintains its form and function. It still serves the same purpose. It can sail the seas, carry goods, and so on. From this perspective, the identity of the ship is tied to its continued existence as a functional object rather than the specific material components that make it up. The ship's identity would be defined by the role it plays and its continuity of function, not by the individual pieces that make it up. Another perspective, however, is that the ship is no longer the same. This argument hinges on the idea that the ship's identity is tied to the specific parts that make it up. If every part of the ship is replaced, then in a way, the original ship no longer exists. The physical parts of the ship that existed originally are gone, and in their place are new parts. The ship might look the same, but it is not the same ship because its constituent elements have been entirely replaced. This leads to a deeper question about what makes something the same over time. Is it the material components that define an object's identity? Or is it the continuity of function and appearance? In the case of the ship, if we focus on the physical parts, then it's easy to say that the ship is no longer the same. But if we focus on the function and the experience of using the ship, it becomes harder to draw a line between the old ship and the new one. This creates a tension between two views of identity, the material view and the functional view. The problem becomes even more complicated when we think about a situation where all the original parts of the ship are gathered together and reassembled into a ship. If the original parts are put back together, is that the real Ship of Theseus? And if so, does that mean that there are now two ships with equal claims to the title of Ship of Theseus? The one with all the original parts and the one with all the new ones? This dilemma brings up the question of whether identity can exist independently of the material components of an object. The ship, after all, has undergone a complete transformation of its parts, but it still serves the same purpose and looks the same. In some sense, the ship is the same because we continue to think of it as such. But in another sense, it is not the same because the original parts are gone. Another way to think about the problem is to consider identity over time. If an object undergoes gradual change over a long period of time, we tend to consider it the same object, even if its components have changed. This is true in many areas of life. For example, when a person ages, their body changes over time. The cells in their body are constantly being replaced, and yet we still consider them the same person. The identity of the person seems to persist, despite the constant change of the physical components. Similarly, we might think of the Ship of Theseus as maintaining its identity over time, even though it's been completely rebuilt. It's the same ship because it serves the same purpose and fulfills the same role, despite the changes in its material parts. This idea suggests that identity is not necessarily tied to the specific components that make up an object, but rather to the continuity of its function and the way it is recognized by others. However, some might argue that the idea of continuity is not enough to preserve identity. If a ship is completely rebuilt, even though it looks the same and performs the same functions, it is no longer the same ship because it no longer has the same parts. In this view, identity is tied to the physical components of the ship, and when those components are replaced, the object's identity changes. This leads to a further complication. If the ship is not the same after all its parts are replaced, then what does it mean for an object to remain the same over time? If the parts of an object can change, and yet the object retains its identity, then we must ask, what exactly is it that persists over time? Is it the material components, the function of the object, or is it something else entirely? This brings us back to the heart of the Ship of Theseus problem, the question of identity over time. The paradox highlights the tension between how we understand objects as having a continuous identity and the reality that those objects are constantly changing. Whether the ship is the same after all the parts are replaced depends on how we define identity. If we define identity in terms of the material components, then the ship is no longer the same. But if we define identity in terms of function and continuity, then the ship can remain the same. The Ship of Theseus also has implications beyond the realm of physical objects. It touches on issues of personal identity and the continuity of the self. Just as the ship changes over time but may still be considered the same, a person changes over the course of their life, with their body and mind constantly evolving. Yet, we continue to consider them the same person. This raises profound questions about what it means to remain the same over time, and whether identity is something that persists despite constant change. The paradox of the Ship of Theseus is an exploration of the nature of identity itself. It challenges us to think deeply about what it means for something to remain the same over time and whether identity is tied to material components or something more abstract, like function or continuity. This thought experiment is a powerful tool for examining the nature of change and persistence, both in the physical world and in the realm of personal identity. It forces us to confront the limits of our understanding of what makes something the same, and asks us to reconsider the ways we define and recognize identity. The drinker paradox is an intriguing, logical thought experiment that takes place in a bar. The paradox starts with a seemingly simple assertion. In any bar, there exists someone such that if they are drinking, everyone is drinking. This statement seems a bit odd at first, and the paradox lies in how logically sound it appears, even though it doesn't align with our everyday experiences. To break down this idea, let's consider a typical bar setting. You walk into a bar, and it's full of people, some of whom are drinking and some of whom aren't. But then, according to the paradox, there exists one person in the bar who holds a very special property. If that person is drinking, then everyone else in the bar is also drinking. This leads to an interesting situation when we apply the logic of this statement to the real world. Let's call the special person Person A. According to the paradox, if Person A is drinking, then everyone else in the bar must also be drinking. But this doesn't stop there. The situation also implies that if Person A is not drinking, the rule doesn't apply. People could be drinking, but it doesn't matter for the rule. The important thing is that if Person A is drinking, then everyone else in the bar must be drinking as well. At this point, you might wonder, how does this logically work? The key to understanding the paradox is that the person doesn't need to be the first to drink or the only one who drinks. The statement works because of how it's set up logically. If Person A starts drinking, the rule dictates that everyone else in the bar must drink too, so they all start drinking as well. The moment Person A is drinking, the whole bar is drinking, and this is in line with the paradox. To illustrate this further, imagine a bar with 10 people. Person A is the one who has the special property. If they drink, everyone else in the bar drinks. Now, Person A takes a sip of their drink. By the paradox, the moment they take a sip, everyone else in the bar must also be drinking. This creates an interesting chain reaction, where the simple act of Person A drinking causes everyone else to drink, following the rules of the paradox. It doesn't matter whether or not anyone else was initially planning to drink. The moment person A drinks, everyone else does too. This is where the paradox becomes both fascinating and a bit counterintuitive. The statement itself is logically sound. It doesn't violate any formal rules of logic. But it doesn't correspond with what we experience in the real world. In everyday life, it's easy to imagine a scenario where only one or two people in the bar are drinking, and the rest of the people are not. But in the world of the drinker paradox, there exists a scenario where, if one person drinks, it leads to everyone drinking. What makes this situation even more intriguing is that the paradox doesn't rely on specific conditions, such as the type of drink or the reason why the person drinks. It only hinges on the rule that if person A drinks, everyone else follows suit. The paradox is not about what happens before or after person A starts drinking. It's about the rule that's established. This is what makes the drinker paradox logically sound, even though it seems completely out of place in real life. To examine this more carefully, consider the chain of reasoning in a more abstract setting. Let's suppose that we have a group of people where each person has a specific characteristic or rule applied to them, similar to person A's drinking rule. Let's say person B has a rule that if they laugh, everyone else laughs. Or person C has a rule that if they leave the room, everyone else must leave. In each case, the rule operates in isolation. The action of one person triggers a response in everyone else. These rules follow simple logical relationships, but they often don't reflect the way the world works in practice. The drinker paradox exists in the same vein as these abstract rules. It works mathematically and logically, but it doesn't describe our everyday experiences. It highlights the difference between what is logically possible in a formal system and what is practically observable in real life. There's also a deeper philosophical angle to the paradox. What does it mean for one person's action to dictate the actions of everyone else? The drinker paradox calls into question the nature of personal agency and collective behavior. If person A can influence the entire bar simply by drinking, how do we think about individual freedom in this context? Can one person's actions shape the collective actions of everyone around them? And if so, to what extent? This connects to broader questions about social behavior and influence. In society, individuals often act based on their own decisions, but they are also influenced by others. The drinker paradox offers a playful version of this dynamic, where the influence of a single person's actions extends to everyone else in the group. In reality, the influence is usually more subtle, and people make choices independently. However, the paradox forces us to consider the idea of influence and how interconnected our actions can be with the actions of those around us. One interesting element of this paradox is that it doesn't require any external enforcement or coercion to function. There is no command or rule imposed by an outside authority saying, "Everyone must drink if person A drinks." Instead, the rule is simply internalized by the setup of the paradox itself. The logic works within the structure of the problem, but it feels strange because it doesn't match the way we typically think about social influence. Furthermore, we might wonder if the paradox is a commentary on the power of rules and systems in shaping behavior. The drinker paradox shows that even in a seemingly simple setting, like a bar, the actions of one person can trigger far-reaching effects, simply because of the rules that govern that environment. It illustrates how systems and rules can create unexpected outcomes, even when they seem counterintuitive. Ultimately, the drinker paradox is an excellent example of how logic can create situations that don't quite align with our real-world experiences. It shows that while something can be logically sound and coherent, it may still seem strange or implausible when applied to the world we live in. The paradox challenges our expectations and assumptions, forcing us to think critically about the nature of influence, behavior, and the relationships between individuals within a system. The Quine Paradox is a fascinating and perplexing example of self-reference and language's ability to create contradictions. It is named after the philosopher Willard Van Orman Quine, who explored how language and meaning can lead to paradoxical situations. The paradox itself involves a sentence that refers to itself and creates a logical loop that is difficult to resolve. The sentence at the heart of the paradox is, "Yields falsehood when preceded by its quotation yields falsehood when preceded by its quotation." At first glance, the sentence seems like a straightforward statement, but as you read it more carefully, it becomes clear that it leads to a logical problem. To break it down, let's first understand what the sentence is saying. The sentence is claiming that the phrase yields falsehood when preceded by its quotation has a particular property. It yields falsehood when it is preceded by its own quotation. Now, let's look at the logic. If we take the sentence at face value and quote it, we are faced with a contradiction. The sentence says that if you take the phrase yields falsehood when preceded by its quotation and place it before its own quotation, it will yield a falsehood. But by this logic, the sentence also claims that it will yield a falsehood when preceded by its own quotation. This sets up a paradox. To understand the paradox more clearly, let's think about it step by step. The phrase yields falsehood when preceded by its quotation is a self-referential statement. It refers to itself. So, if you take the sentence and place it before the quotation marks, you are left with a situation where the sentence is asserting that it yields a falsehood when quoted. But the act of quoting it seems to make the sentence true. This creates a loop where the sentence both is and isn't true, depending on how it's interpreted. To simplify this, let's imagine a situation where the sentence is part of a larger set of rules for understanding truth and falsehood. Normally, we expect a sentence to either be true or false, but self-referential sentences like this one introduce a gray area where the rules no longer apply in the same way. If we say the sentence is true, it implies that the sentence itself will yield a falsehood when quoted, which contradicts the idea that it is true. But if we say the sentence is false, it also causes a problem because it means the sentence should yield a falsehood when quoted, but it does not. This paradox is a variant of other well-known paradoxes in philosophy and logic, such as the liar paradox. The liar paradox is a statement like, "This sentence is false." If the sentence is true, then it must be false, but if it's false, then it must be true. The Quine Paradox works in a similar way because it sets up a situation where the sentence cannot consistently be either true or false. One of the key features of the Quine Paradox is that it arises from the structure of language itself. The paradox occurs because the sentence is self-referential. It talks about its own quotation and creates a loop of reasoning that does not resolve in a simple way. This is a common feature of many paradoxes involving self-reference. The idea of self-reference is powerful because it shows how language can lead to contradictions or problems in logic that seem impossible to resolve. The paradox also touches on deeper issues about meaning and interpretation. In ordinary language, we expect sentences to have clear meanings that can be understood in a straightforward way. But self-referential sentences, like the Quine Paradox, show that meaning can become unclear or ambiguous when a sentence refers to itself. This leads us to question how we understand language and meaning. Are we always able to interpret statements clearly? Or do we need to account for the possibility that language itself can lead to confusion and contradiction? Another interesting aspect of the Quine Paradox is how it challenges our understanding of truth. We often think of truth as being binary. Something is either true or false. But the Quine Paradox forces us to reconsider this view of truth. The sentence doesn't fit neatly into the category of being either true or false. It seems to create a situation where truth is not a simple matter of determining whether a statement is correct. Instead, truth becomes entangled with the structure of language and the way in which sentences refer to themselves. In this way, the Quine Paradox also touches on issues related to the foundations of logic and the limits of formal systems. In mathematical logic, for example, systems are designed to avoid contradictions by setting strict rules for how statements can be constructed and interpreted. The Quine Paradox, however, shows how even simple language can lead to contradictions if we do not carefully consider how statements refer to themselves. This raises questions about the completeness and consistency of logical systems. If self-referential sentences can lead to paradoxes, what does this say about the ability of formal systems to account for all forms of reasoning? One possible response to the Quine Paradox is to embrace the idea that self-referential sentences simply cannot be consistently evaluated as true or false. In other words, the sentence yields falsehood when preceded by its quotation yields falsehood when preceded by its quotation might simply be meaningless in the way we normally think of statements as having a truth value. This would require us to rethink the way we handle self-referential sentences in logic and language. Instead of trying to assign them a truth value, we might need to treat them as outside the realm of normal reasoning and interpretation. Another possible response is to modify the rules of logic to account for self-referential sentences. Some logicians have developed systems of logic, such as par-consistent logic, that allow for contradictions to coexist without collapsing the system. In these systems, it's possible to say that a sentence can be both true and false, or that the usual rules of logic don't apply to certain kinds of sentences. This approach allows us to handle paradoxes like the Quine Paradox in a way that does not lead to logical collapse. However, this raises further questions about the nature of truth and reasoning. If we allow contradictions to coexist, what does this mean for the way we understand logic and reasoning as a whole? Can we still trust the conclusions we reach if contradictions are allowed to exist within our system of logic? The Quine Paradox, in the end, forces us to confront the limitations of language, truth, and logic. It shows that our understanding of meaning and interpretation can be challenged when sentences refer to themselves. This paradox reveals how the structure of language can create situations where our usual understanding of truth and falsehood breaks down, forcing us to think more deeply about the nature of reasoning itself. The paradox is both a puzzle and an opportunity to explore the boundaries of language and logic, encouraging us to consider the complexities of self-reference and the implications it has for our understanding of meaning. The Omnipotence Paradox is a classic philosophical question that challenges the concept of omnipotence, or being all-powerful. The paradox is often phrased like this: can an all-powerful being create a rock so heavy that they cannot lift it? On the surface, this question seems to test the very limits of power, but it raises deeper issues about the nature of power, logic, and meaning itself. To understand the paradox, let's first break down the elements of the question. An omnipotent being, by definition, has the power to do anything. There are no limits to their abilities. If this being is all-powerful, then logically they should be able to perform any action, including creating a rock that is beyond their ability to lift. But at the same time, if they cannot lift the rock they've created, does that mean they are not omnipotent? This creates a conflict, as it suggests that omnipotence might have a limit after all. On one hand, the question seems absurd, because the idea of an all-powerful being doing something that contradicts itself seems nonsensical. How can omnipotence include the power to create contradictions? The paradox forces us to consider whether true omnipotence can really encompass logically impossible actions that are not just difficult but fundamentally incoherent. For example, creating a rock so heavy that it cannot be lifted is not a task that can be framed in any meaningful way. It's not about a physical object being too heavy. It's about the concept of heaviness and lifting conflicting in a way that doesn't even make sense. A task like this doesn't test power. It tests the limits of language and thought. To further explore this, imagine a person who is extremely strong. They may be able to lift a 1,000-pound weight, but there's a limit to what they can physically do. If asked to lift something that is infinitely heavy, the question would seem meaningless because lifting an infinite weight is not even a coherent idea. In a similar way, the Omnipotence Paradox suggests that the question about the rock doesn't involve a true test of omnipotence. It involves a misunderstanding of what omnipotence means. Another way to approach this paradox is to think about omnipotence not as the ability to do everything, but as the ability to do anything that is logically possible. If an omnipotent being is defined as someone who can do anything that can be done without violating logic, then creating a rock that cannot be lifted is not within the scope of omnipotence, because it's not a logically coherent task to begin with. The idea of making a rock too heavy to lift is similar to asking if someone can create a square circle. Both questions ask for an action that doesn't make sense within the rules of logic, so they fall outside the realm of what can be done. This leads to the idea that omnipotence might have limits, not in terms of power, but in terms of logical coherence. Power, in this view, isn't about the ability to perform impossible tasks, but the ability to accomplish anything that is logically possible. For example, an omnipotent being could create any object or perform any action within the boundaries of logic, but they would not be able to perform an action that involves a logical contradiction, such as creating a rock too heavy to lift. The Omnipotence Paradox also invites us to consider what it means for a being to be truly all-powerful. Power, in most contexts, is understood as the ability to cause change or bring about effects in the world. But when the task itself is logically incoherent, it's not about power, it's about language and meaning. It's similar to asking someone to perform a task that involves breaking the rules of language or grammar. No matter how powerful a person is, they cannot change the rules of logic itself. Furthermore, this paradox raises a deeper philosophical question about the nature of power and limits. Does power have to mean absolute freedom from all constraints, or is it more about the ability to do what is possible within a certain framework? In some philosophical traditions, power is understood as the ability to bring about any effect, but this doesn't mean that every request or action is logically possible. This distinction is important because it suggests that true omnipotence doesn't require the ability to do the logically impossible. It requires the ability to do anything that can be done within the confines of reality and logic. There's also an ethical dimension to the paradox. If we imagine an all-powerful being, we might assume they could do anything, even if it defies our understanding of power. But should an all-powerful being do everything they are capable of doing? Power often comes with responsibility. If a being has the ability to do anything, should they do things that are logically absurd or that undermine the very nature of existence? The Omnipotence Paradox forces us to think not just about the limits of power, but also about the wisdom and ethics that would guide its use. Just because something can be done doesn't mean it should be done, and the ability to do everything doesn't necessarily mean that one should do anything that is logically meaningless. This also ties into the debate about whether omnipotence is even a meaningful concept. If an omnipotent being cannot perform logically contradictory actions, does that mean they aren't truly all-powerful? Some philosophers argue that omnipotence should be understood as the ability to do anything that can be done, not as the ability to do the logically impossible. This is a crucial distinction because it shows that power should be considered in terms of what is logically achievable, not in terms of hypothetical contradictions that don't make sense within the framework of logic. In a way, the Omnipotence Paradox forces us to confront the tension between the concept of unlimited power and the nature of logical coherence. It highlights the limits of language when we talk about absolute power and challenges us to think about what omnipotence truly means. Rather than asking whether an all-powerful being can do something that violates logic, we should ask whether the concept of omnipotence itself is better understood as the power to do everything logically possible, without requiring the ability to perform logically impossible or self-contradictory tasks. In the end, the Omnipotence Paradox doesn't so much challenge the idea of omnipotence as it challenges our assumptions about power, logic, and meaning. It invites us to reconsider how we think about the nature of absolute power and how we understand the limits of what is possible. By recognizing that true omnipotence is not about doing the impossible, but about the ability to do all things that are logically coherent, we can begin to resolve the paradox and come to a deeper understanding of what it means for something to be truly all-powerful. The meta-paradox explores an interesting and fundamental question. Why do paradoxes exist at all? If logic is sound and works according to established rules, then paradoxes, statements or situations that seem self-contradictory or logically impossible, should not exist. At first glance, it might seem like the presence of paradoxes suggests that something is wrong with our logical systems. After all, logic is supposed to bring clarity, resolve confusion, and allow us to draw consistent conclusions. So, why do paradoxes arise, and what do they tell us about the nature of logic itself? To begin, we need to define what we mean by paradox. A paradox is a situation or statement that defies intuition or challenges our standard understanding of logic. It often involves a contradiction or an outcome that seems impossible based on the assumptions we start with. Classic examples of paradoxes include the liar paradox, where a statement like, "This sentence is false," creates a contradiction, and the Ship of Theseus, where a series of replacements of parts raises the question of whether the ship remains the same. These paradoxes seem to break the rules of logic, or at least stretch them in ways that force us to reconsider the foundations of reasoning. If logic is supposed to be a system that reliably leads to true conclusions, how can paradoxes exist within it? The answer lies in the complexity of how we use and interpret logic. Logic itself is a tool, a set of rules and principles for reasoning, but the way we apply it is subject to certain limitations. Paradoxes often arise not because logic itself is flawed, but because of the assumptions or systems we use to apply it. The fact that paradoxes exist tells us that even well-established logical systems can be incomplete or have boundaries that we might not fully understand. consider the nature of language and self-reference. Many paradoxes, such as the liar paradox, arise because of self-referential statements that refer to themselves. For example, the sentence "this sentence is false" creates a situation where it cannot consistently be either true or false. This problem is not necessarily a flaw in logic, but rather an issue with how we construct statements and reason about them. The paradox emerges from the particular way language works, rather than from any failure in logic itself. The liar paradox shows that logic can become tangled when we deal with self-reference, revealing limitations in how we interpret statements and how they interact within a logical system. Similarly, many paradoxes arise from assumptions about infinity, continuity, or self-referential structures that seem perfectly logical until we apply them to specific situations. For instance, Zeno's paradoxes, which involve the idea that motion is impossible because one must always reach the halfway point, challenge our basic understanding of space and time. These paradoxes seem to defy the laws of reasoning by suggesting that something as straightforward as movement or change is paradoxical. But they don't indicate a flaw in logic. They highlight the difficulty of applying logic to certain real-world concepts, like infinity, that don't fit neatly into our conventional understanding. Another key reason paradoxes exist is that the structures of our logical systems themselves might be incomplete. The most famous example of this comes from Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorems. Gödel showed that in any logical system that is sufficiently powerful to describe arithmetic, there will always be statements that cannot be proven true or false within that system. This means that logic, as we typically understand it, has inherent limitations. Paradoxes emerge because there are limits to the types of reasoning and proofs that any logical system can offer. In essence, while logic is a powerful tool, it is not all-encompassing, and paradoxes are a natural consequence of these limits. In addition, paradoxes often arise when we push logical systems beyond their intended boundaries. A good example of this is the well-known paradox of set theory known as Russell's paradox. This paradox arises when we consider the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. Russell showed that such a set cannot exist without leading to a contradiction. This paradox emerged because set theory was initially developed with the assumption that any well-defined collection of objects could form a set. Russell's paradox revealed that this assumption was flawed, and it led to the development of more refined and restricted systems of set theory, such as Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory. In this case, the paradox wasn't caused by a failure of logic, but by an assumption that was too broad to be consistently applied in all cases. The existence of paradoxes is also tied to the complexity of reasoning about real-world scenarios. In real life, we often deal with situations that involve nuance, ambiguity, or multiple layers of interpretation. Logic works well in abstract, controlled environments, but when we apply it to real-world situations, it can become difficult to maintain clarity. Paradoxes are often the result of trying to apply simple logical rules to complex, multifaceted problems. This is why paradoxes often emerge in areas like ethics, language, and personal identity, areas where rules and definitions are less clear-cut. For example, paradoxes related to personal identity, like the Ship of Theseus, challenge our understanding of what makes something the same over time. The paradox occurs because our logical systems are often unable to account for the fluidity and complexity inherent in such concepts. Another reason for the existence of paradoxes is that our understanding of logic and reasoning evolves over time. Early logical systems were relatively simple and focused on binary structures. Things were either true or false, and there was little room for ambiguity. But as philosophy, mathematics, and science progressed, new logical systems emerged that allowed for more subtle distinctions. For instance, fuzzy logic allows for reasoning where truth values are not limited to true or false, but can take on intermediate values. This expansion of logical systems helps us resolve some paradoxes, but also reveals that the nature of truth and reasoning is more complex than we initially thought. The question of why paradoxes exist also brings us back to the nature of meaning. Paradoxes often arise from ambiguities in language or concepts. Words can have multiple meanings, and phrases can be interpreted in different ways. For instance, in the liar paradox, the phrase "this sentence is false" can be interpreted in various ways, leading to conflicting conclusions. The ambiguity of language itself can be a source of paradoxes, as we try to fit complex ideas into finite structures of meaning. In some sense, paradoxes are a natural feature of any system that deals with complexity, whether it's a logical system, language, or even human thought. They challenge us to refine our understanding and push the boundaries of what is possible within a system. The fact that paradoxes exist shows that our logical systems are not infallible or complete. Instead, they reveal the limitations of reasoning and encourage us to think more deeply about the assumptions and principles that underlie our understanding of the world. The existence of paradoxes also invites us to reconsider our approach to logic itself. Instead of seeing paradoxes as flaws in our reasoning, we might view them as opportunities to expand and improve our logical frameworks. Paradoxes force us to confront the boundaries of knowledge, helping us refine our understanding of how logic works and how it interacts with language, meaning, and reality. They push us to acknowledge that while logic is a powerful tool, it cannot provide all the answers, and sometimes the questions we ask are more complex than we realize. Ultimately, the question of why paradoxes exist highlights the richness and depth of human reasoning. Far from being a simple failure of logic, paradoxes reflect the complexity of the world around us and the limitations of the systems we use to understand it. They force us to acknowledge the uncertainty and ambiguity inherent in our thinking, and in doing so, they deepen our understanding of both logic and reality itself. The concept of the eternal return, also known as eternal recurrence, is a philosophical idea that suggests the universe and time may be infinite, meaning that everything, every event, action, and moment in your life could repeat itself over and over again, forever. If the universe is infinite and the number of possible events is finite, then it follows that every possible sequence of events will eventually occur again, and because time is also infinite, this cycle of events would continue indefinitely. The idea itself is ancient, with roots in various philosophical traditions, but it was famously proposed by Friedrich Nietzsche in his work Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Nietzsche presented the eternal return as a thought experiment and a challenge. If you were to live your life again and again, exactly as you've lived it before, how would that change the way you live now? The idea can be both unsettling and liberating. It questions our understanding of time, existence, and personal responsibility. At its core, the eternal return is grounded in the idea of infinity. If time has no beginning and no end, and the universe contains a finite number of events and outcomes, it logically follows that eventually, every sequence of events would repeat. This doesn't mean that everything happens at once or in some random order. It means that, given infinite time, the exact same sequence of events would occur again. This includes your life, down to every detail. Your thoughts, your actions, the conversations you have, the choices you make. Each moment of your life would reoccur infinitely. The challenge of the eternal return is philosophical but deeply personal. If you knew that your life was destined to repeat itself exactly the same way, would you live differently? Would you be more deliberate in your choices, knowing that every decision you make could be repeated infinitely? The prospect of living the same life over and over again could lead to feelings of dread, as it suggests a lack of true novelty or escape. But it could also be a powerful way of viewing existence, as it forces us to appreciate each moment as something that will be relived for eternity. Consider this scenario. You wake up tomorrow and make the same choices you did today. You go to the same coffee shop, you meet the same people, you have the same conversations. As time stretches on, you begin to realize that this pattern is not just a possibility, it is an inevitability. Every day that passes is not just another day. It's a replay of the exact same sequence of events, and this cycle will continue for eternity. If you embrace the idea of the eternal return, you might feel pressure to live your life in a way that feels worthy of infinite repetition. On the other hand, this idea might provoke despair. The thought of eternal repetition can seem suffocating. If everything you do is predestined to repeat forever, then your choices, actions, and experiences seem meaningless in the grand scale of eternity. If you view the universe as infinite and time as cyclical, it could feel like there's no real progress or change, just a continuous loop. The endless recurrence of your life might strip it of its urgency or significance. But Nietzsche proposed that the eternal return isn't just an existential burden. He challenged us to approach it as a test. If you could accept the idea that your life will repeat itself eternally, would you live differently? Nietzsche didn't want us to wallow in despair at the idea of repetition. He wanted us to embrace it. His view was that if we could fully affirm our lives, every hardship, every joy, every disappointment, then we would live in a way that transcends mere survival and becomes a celebration of existence itself. To live as if every moment would be repeated forever is to live with profound purpose and integrity. This perspective also forces us to reconsider the nature of time itself. In most of our daily lives, we view time as a linear progression. We think of the future as something yet to happen, and the past as something already gone. But the concept of the eternal return suggests that time could be cyclical rather than linear. If every event repeats itself, then the future becomes something that is already written, and the past is something that is continuously coming back around. It calls into question how we measure time and how we understand the flow of events. Additionally, the eternal return can prompt a reflection on the choices we make in life. If you knew that your actions would repeat for eternity, would you still make the same choices? Would you live the same life? Or would you seek to make a more meaningful and deliberate existence? The concept asks us to evaluate the significance of every moment and every decision. Are we living in a way that we would be willing to relive over and over again? Would we be proud of the life we've lived, knowing that it's not just a finite experience but one that echoes infinitely? This challenge is more than just a thought experiment. It can serve as a tool for personal growth. By imagining that every action is repeated forever, we are forced to think about the long-term consequences of our choices. If you could live your life over and over again, would you choose to pursue the same goals? Would you follow the same relationships, make the same decisions? Or would you strive to make different choices, knowing that those actions would live on for eternity? The eternal return also connects to the idea of fate versus free will. In a universe where everything repeats, are we truly free to choose our path? If everything is bound to repeat, does that mean we are predestined to live out our lives in a specific way? Alternatively, could we find freedom in accepting that the universe is infinite and that our existence is just one of many cycles? Perhaps the power lies not in changing the repetition itself, but in how we choose to approach it. Nietzsche's challenge is about embracing life with all its repetition, rather than trying to escape from it. To further understand the implications of the eternal return, think of the universe itself. If the universe is infinite, then every event that happens, no matter how small or insignificant, could recur over and over again. This includes not only the broad strokes of human history, like the rise and fall of civilizations, but also the smallest personal moments, like your first cup of coffee in the morning. It implies that time isn't just a line stretching from the past to the future, but a vast circle, constantly looping back on itself. The idea of the eternal return also forces us to confront the possibility of infinite repetitions of not just the good and beautiful moments in life, but the painful ones as well. If every moment repeats, then every regret, every loss, and every hardship would return as well. This is one of the darker aspects of the idea. Can we truly accept that all of our struggles, mistakes, and sorrows would come back around in an eternal cycle? Nietzsche's idea is radical because it asks us to not only embrace our happiness and successes, but to find a way to accept every hardship as part of the eternal process of existence. Ultimately, the eternal return invites us to think deeply about how we live and what we value. It raises important questions about time, existence, and personal agency. If our lives are repeating endlessly, what does that say about the meaning of life? Can we find meaning in a cycle that seems to repeat without end? Or does it diminish the importance of what we do? The paradox challenges us to live intentionally, to make choices we can be proud of, and to find meaning in the very fact of existence itself, no matter how often it repeats. The lottery paradox is a situation in which we hold two contradictory beliefs about a lottery. On the one hand, we believe that every individual ticket will lose, yet we also believe that one of the tickets must win. At first, this seems like a clear contradiction, and the paradox arises when we try to reconcile these two beliefs. How can we believe that every ticket will lose while simultaneously believing that one ticket will win? To start, let's break down the situation step by step. Imagine a lottery with a large number of tickets, say 1 million tickets. You buy one ticket and, like everyone else who buys a ticket, you are hoping for the best. At the same time, however, you know that only one ticket will win, meaning that 999,999 tickets will lose. You might think that the odds of winning are slim, but you still hope that yours will be the winning ticket. Now, here's where the paradox comes into play. Let's say that you know that only one ticket will win, and the other tickets will all lose. This knowledge is certain, and you hold this belief very strongly. In fact, you believe with complete confidence that your ticket will lose, just like all the others. Yet, despite this belief, you also hold another belief, that one ticket, any ticket, will win. You believe that out of the million tickets, one of them must be the winner, but you don't think it will be your own. There's a certainty in your mind that your ticket will lose, but you still believe that the process will result in a winner. The contradiction arises when we ask how these two beliefs can coexist. How can you believe that all the tickets will lose, including your own, and also believe that one ticket will win? You cannot hold both beliefs at the same time without creating a logical inconsistency. If you believe every ticket will lose, then it is logically impossible for one ticket to win. On the other hand, if you believe that one ticket will win, then you cannot logically believe that every ticket, including your own, will lose. This creates the paradox. Let's think of this situation in a more relatable context. Suppose you have a box of marbles and you know that only one of the marbles is red and the rest are all white. You believe with certainty that when you draw a marble from the box, it will be white. But you also believe that there is one red marble in the box. There's an inconsistency here. If you know that there's one red marble and you draw a marble, how can you be so certain that you'll draw a white one? The belief that you'll draw a white marble doesn't seem to fit with the knowledge that a red marble must be drawn at some point. This is what makes the lottery paradox so intriguing. It shows how our beliefs can be inconsistent when we apply logic in a way that seems rational, but still leads to a contradiction. We hold two conflicting beliefs about the lottery: that every ticket will lose and that one ticket will win. Logically, we cannot hold both beliefs at the same time. Yet we do. In real life, people often reason this way about lotteries, and it seems to work without causing major problems, until we step back and analyze the situation more carefully. One way to look at this paradox is through the lens of probability. In the lottery example, we know that there is only a small chance that any given ticket will win. The odds are stacked against us, but the belief that one ticket will win comes from understanding that the lottery is structured to guarantee a winner, no matter how small the probability. We may have a strong belief that our own ticket will lose, but this is a result of knowing the odds, not of the structure of the lottery itself. However, when we hold the belief that our ticket will lose while also believing that one ticket must win, we are effectively treating the lottery as two separate events. We are treating the outcome of our ticket, whether it wins or loses, as a personal certainty, while simultaneously treating the overall structure of the lottery as a probability event. The paradox emerges because these two ways of thinking about the lottery are logically incompatible when examined together. This conflict between certainty about individual tickets and probability about the overall lottery is what makes the paradox puzzling. The paradox is not about the fact that the odds of winning are low. In fact, the odds are extremely low. The paradox is about the way we can hold two beliefs that conflict with each other without ever noticing the inconsistency. It's like thinking that you'll lose every time, but also knowing that someone must win. This paradox also touches on deeper questions about how we think about probabilities and certainty. How do we balance our personal beliefs about outcomes with our knowledge of the larger structure of probability? We often make decisions based on probabilities, but we also have strong personal convictions about the specific outcome of events, especially when we have a personal stake in the outcome, such as buying a lottery ticket. We may feel that it's a certainty that our ticket will lose, but we also feel a sense of hope that the process will result in a winner. These conflicting mental states show us that our understanding of probabilities is not always as clear-cut as we might expect. The lottery paradox also raises questions about how we deal with uncertainty in our lives. When we understand that only one ticket will win, we may convince ourselves that we're certain we won't be the one to win. But the paradox shows that our mental certainty about the outcome, our personal belief that we will lose, does not align with the overall structure of the situation. The paradox is a reminder that we often have to reconcile our personal beliefs and biases with the larger picture of probabilities and outcomes. One interesting aspect of the lottery paradox is that it's not confined to the realm of lotteries. It can be applied to any situation where we have competing beliefs about personal certainty and overall probability. For example, consider a job interview. You may believe that you will not get the job because the competition is fierce and the odds are against you. But you also know that one person will get the job, someone has to win, and there's a chance that it could be you. In this scenario, you are caught between two conflicting beliefs: that you will not succeed because the odds are against you, and that someone will succeed because that's the nature of the process. This mirrors the lottery paradox and shows how our beliefs about personal outcomes can be shaped by our understanding of larger systems of probability. Ultimately, the lottery paradox forces us to confront the limits of our reasoning when it comes to probability. While we can logically reason that only one ticket will win, we cannot fully reconcile that knowledge with the emotional certainty we feel about our personal chances. The paradox exposes how human cognition and emotion can shape our understanding of chance and outcomes, even when they contradict the larger logic of probability. Hempel's Raven paradox is a strange and counterintuitive puzzle that arises from a basic principle of scientific reasoning known as confirmation theory. It involves the process of gathering evidence to confirm or disconfirm a hypothesis. In this paradox, we find that observing something completely unrelated to the subject of a hypothesis can, in a technical sense, provide evidence for that hypothesis. The paradox challenges how we think about what counts as evidence and how confirmation works in scientific reasoning. The paradox starts with a simple hypothesis: all ravens are black. This is a straightforward statement about ravens, and it suggests that if you look at enough ravens, you should see that they are all black. So far, so good. This is a testable hypothesis, and we can confirm it by observing ravens in the real world. If we observe a raven and find that it is black, that supports the hypothesis. On the other hand, if we observe a raven that is not black, that would disconfirm the hypothesis. Now, the paradox arises from an application of the principle of confirmation in logic and scientific reasoning. The principle suggests that evidence which supports a hypothesis should count as confirming that hypothesis. So, if we see a raven that is black, that should confirm the hypothesis all ravens are black. But here's where the paradox gets interesting. According to the same principle, if we see something that is not a raven and it is black, say a black cat, this also confirms the hypothesis that all ravens are black. This is because seeing a black object that is not a raven still doesn't contradict the hypothesis that all ravens are black. So far, it seems reasonable. But here comes the twist. If we see a green apple, it also counts as confirmation for the hypothesis that all ravens are black. This is where things start to feel odd. How could observing a green apple, a fruit, possibly confirm a statement about ravens? After all, the green apple has nothing to do with ravens. The confusion arises because confirmation theory is more about the logical structure of evidence than it is about relevance or direct connection. In the logic of confirmation, any observation that does not contradict the hypothesis is considered to be weakly supportive of it. A green apple, being neither a raven nor black, doesn't contradict the hypothesis that all ravens are black. Therefore, it is, technically, evidence that does not disprove the hypothesis, and in the structure of confirmation theory, it is treated as confirming it, albeit in a very indirect and unintuitive way. To make this clearer, consider a scenario where you are testing a hypothesis about a certain type of bird. Suppose you hypothesize that all flamingos are pink. If you see a flamingo that is pink, that's strong evidence supporting your hypothesis. But what about when you see a pink elephant? In the logic of confirmation theory, seeing a pink elephant does not disprove your hypothesis, because it doesn't contradict it. In fact, the observation of any non-flamingo pink animal, in principle, weakly supports the hypothesis that all flamingos are pink, even though it has no direct relevance to flamingos. The more we stretch this reasoning, the more absurd it begins to seem. Each additional, unrelated piece of evidence seems to add weak confirmation to the hypothesis, even though it seems irrelevant to the subject at hand. This paradox isn't just a quirky logical exercise. It exposes an important gap in how we think about confirmation and evidence in real-world scientific inquiry. Hempel's Raven Paradox challenges us to think about the difference between what counts as confirming a hypothesis logically versus what counts as practically supporting it. In science, we are usually more concerned with direct evidence that has a clear connection to the hypothesis. For example, if we observe a raven and it is black, that seems like direct and relevant evidence supporting the hypothesis all ravens are black. But seeing a green apple, which has no connection to ravens, intuitively doesn't seem to provide any meaningful confirmation. What Hempel's Raven Paradox highlights is that our everyday understanding of evidence is often different from the formal rules of confirmation theory. Confirmation theory treats any observation that does not contradict a hypothesis as evidence in favor of it. This leads to the conclusion that seeing a green apple can, in theory, count as confirming the hypothesis that all ravens are black, even though it doesn't feel like it should. The paradox reveals that our intuitions about evidence and confirmation are sometimes at odds with the formal structures of logical reasoning. To resolve the paradox, we need to reconsider how we think about confirmation and evidence. One approach is to refine our understanding of what counts as evidence. In real scientific practice, not all observations are treated as equally relevant. For example, seeing a black cat does not provide nearly as strong a confirmation of the hypothesis all ravens are black as seeing a black raven would. The reason is that, in practice, we treat evidence as more relevant when it is directly related to the hypothesis we are testing. Confirmation theory, on the other hand, is more concerned with logical consistency and the relationship between observations and hypotheses, regardless of relevance. Another possible resolution is to recognize the difference between weak and strong confirmation. In the case of the green apple, while the observation doesn't contradict the hypothesis, it provides very weak confirmation because it is so unrelated to the hypothesis about ravens. In scientific practice, we typically focus on strong confirmation, evidence that directly supports the hypothesis in a meaningful way. Weak confirmation, like seeing a green apple, is much less informative and doesn't carry the same weight as a direct observation of a black raven. By acknowledging the difference between weak and strong evidence, we can better understand the limitations of confirmation theory and avoid drawing absurd conclusions. The Raven Paradox is not just an abstract thought experiment. It also has real implications for how we think about evidence in science and reasoning. The paradox teaches us that logical reasoning can sometimes produce counterintuitive results, especially when we apply it in a formal way that doesn't account for relevance or practical connections between observations and hypotheses. It forces us to think carefully about how we use logic in real-world contexts and how we balance formal reasoning with our intuitions about what constitutes meaningful evidence. In conclusion, Hempel's Raven Paradox challenges us to reconsider the rules of confirmation theory and how we think about evidence. While confirmation theory logically tells us that observing a green apple weakly supports the hypothesis that all ravens are black, it doesn't align with our everyday understanding of what constitutes good evidence. The paradox forces us to ask deeper questions about how we define and use evidence, and how we distinguish between logically valid but practically irrelevant observations and truly meaningful confirmations. It reminds us that while formal logic can be powerful, it must be applied carefully and thoughtfully to produce conclusions that are aligned with our practical experience of the world. Zeno's paradox presents a puzzle about motion, time, and infinity. It suggests that to reach a destination, you must first reach the halfway point, then the halfway point of that, and so on infinitely. In theory, this means that no matter how far you travel, there will always be an infinite number of halfway points you must pass before you reach your destination. So, how is it possible to ever actually get there? This paradox seems to suggest that movement is impossible, which clearly contradicts our everyday experience, where we easily travel from one place to another. The paradox forces us to confront the nature of infinity and how it interacts with real-world concepts like time and space. The most famous version of Zeno's paradox is known as the Achilles and the tortoise scenario. In this version, Achilles races a tortoise, and as part of the agreement, the tortoise is given a head start. Zeno argues that Achilles can never catch the tortoise. Why? Because as soon as Achilles starts running, the tortoise has already moved ahead by a certain distance. Now, in order to catch up, Achilles must first reach the point where the tortoise was, but by the time Achilles gets there, the tortoise has moved a bit further ahead. Then, Achilles must reach the next point where the tortoise has moved, and so on endlessly. Since there are an infinite number of points Achilles must pass, Zeno argues that he will never catch the tortoise, no matter how fast he runs. First, this seems absurd. We know from experience that if Achilles runs fast enough, he will catch the tortoise. But Zeno's paradox forces us to think more deeply about the idea of infinity. In the framework of the paradox, there are infinitely many halfway points between Achilles and the tortoise. If we think of each point as a separate task, then Achilles must complete an infinite number of tasks, reaching each halfway point, before he can catch the tortoise. In a world of infinity, can any task actually be completed? Zeno's paradox suggests that, logically, it's impossible. To understand why this paradox is so puzzling, let's consider it in terms of a real-world example. Imagine you are walking to a door that is 10 feet away. According to Zeno's paradox, in order to reach the door, you must first get halfway there, so you would walk 5 feet. After that, you must walk halfway between where you are and the door, so you would walk 2.5 feet. Then, you must walk halfway again, 1.25 feet, and so on. According to the paradox, you would need to complete an infinite number of steps, each half the previous step, before you reach the door. So, how can you ever reach it? The key to resolving this paradox lies in understanding how infinity works in mathematics. While Zeno's paradox presents an infinite number of steps, the total distance you need to travel is finite. The sum of the infinite series that Zeno describes actually adds up to a finite number. In our example, even though you are having the distance infinitely, the total distance you travel adds up to 10 feet, not an infinite amount. The total distance traveled in Zeno's paradox is the sum of the following series: 5 plus 2.5 plus 1.25 plus 0.625 plus, and so on. This is an example of a converging series, where the total sum approaches a limit. Mathematically, the sum of this infinite series is exactly 10 feet, meaning that it is possible to reach the door after completing all the infinite steps. This might sound confusing at first, because infinity seems to suggest that something can never end. But in this case, the concept of infinite steps doesn't mean an infinite distance. Instead, each step becomes smaller and smaller, and the sum of those steps reaches a finite value. The paradox arises when we fail to recognize that the total number of steps, even though infinite, results in a finite journey. The resolution of Zeno's paradox involves understanding how we can handle infinite sequences mathematically. Even though there are an infinite number of steps to reach the door, the total time and distance required to complete them is finite. This idea was developed into the concept of limits in calculus, which allows us to deal with infinite series in a meaningful way. The paradox relies on the misleading assumption that infinite steps require infinite time or distance, when in fact, they can sum to a finite value. So, Zeno's paradox challenges our intuition by presenting an infinite number of steps but doesn't take into account how those steps can add up to a finite total. It forces us to rethink how we understand time and space, especially when dealing with the concept of infinity. In real life, we don't perceive the infinite number of points between us and our destination. We just experience the journey, and the total time and distance needed to reach our goal are finite, even if the number of steps is infinite. Zeno's paradox also highlights the nature of infinity itself. Infinity is not a number we can count to. It's a concept that describes something that has no end. But just because something is infinite doesn't mean it can't be quantified or resolved. The paradox plays with our natural assumption that infinity means never-ending in a way that prevents us from achieving anything. But in mathematics, infinite processes can still have finite results. This is a crucial concept in calculus, where we deal with infinite series that sum to finite values. One more way to look at the paradox is through the lens of motion and time. In the paradox, each step that Achilles must take is smaller than the last, meaning that the process of catching up seems like it could take forever. But in reality, time itself is continuous and does not break into infinite discrete moments that would prevent us from completing the journey. We perceive the movement from one point to another as a smooth, continuous process, not as a series of infinite steps. The paradox forces us to think about the differences between the discrete steps that make up an infinite sequence and the continuous flow of time and motion. At a deeper level, Zeno's paradox is a meditation on the nature of the universe and the challenges of reasoning about things that are infinite or beyond our immediate experience. It highlights the tension between what we intuitively understand about the world and what mathematical reasoning can tell us about the way things work on a more abstract level. Zeno's paradox is not just a puzzle about motion. It's a way to think about the limitations of our perception and how mathematical concepts like infinity can challenge our understanding of reality. In conclusion, Zeno's paradox invites us to reconsider our intuitions about time, distance, and motion. It shows that infinite processes can yield finite results and forces us to think more carefully about how we conceptualize infinity. By understanding how infinite sequences can sum to a finite total, we resolve the paradox and gain a deeper insight into the way mathematics works in the real world. What seems paradoxical on the surface is, in fact, an opportunity to explore the power of mathematical reasoning and the limits of human perception. The problem of the criterion is a philosophical dilemma that arises when we try to determine what is true or justified. The paradox lies in the fact that in order to decide what is true, we need a standard or criterion to judge truth. But in order to know which standard to use, we must already know what is true. This creates a circular problem. How can we decide what is true without first knowing what standard to apply? And how can we know the standard if we haven't already determined the truth? Let's break this down with an example. Imagine you're trying to figure out whether a particular statement is true. For example, the sky is blue. In order to know if this statement is true, you need a standard of truth. This standard might be something like, what I see with my eyes, or what science tells us. But how do you know which standard is correct? If you don't already know what counts as truth, how can you decide which standard to apply? The circular nature of this problem becomes evident. To judge the truth of the statement, the sky is blue, you need a criterion. But in order to pick the right criterion, you need to already know what is true. If you start with no criterion, you can't decide what counts as true, but without knowing what counts as true, you can't settle on the right criterion. One way to understand this problem is by considering how we typically verify something as true. In many cases, we rely on evidence or reasoning that follows established standards. For example, if we want to know whether the sky is blue, we might look at it, ask others, or refer to scientific knowledge about light and color. These standards help us decide what is true. But the problem is that these standards themselves often depend on assumptions about what counts as evidence or what methods of reasoning are valid. For instance, we assume that our senses are reliable, or that scientific methods can accurately describe the world. But these assumptions are not self-evident. In order to justify using these standards, we need to know what counts as true. And there we are, back in the circular loop. We need a standard to judge what is true, but we need truth to know which standard to use. This problem is particularly troubling in areas like epistemology, which is the branch of philosophy concerned with knowledge. In epistemology, we ask questions like, how do we know what we know? And what counts as justified belief? The problem of the criterion brings these questions into sharp focus. It suggests that, in order to know whether a belief is justified, we need to have a standard of justification. But we can't determine the right standard without already knowing something about what is true. In other words, any attempt to justify a belief seems to depend on an already established truth, and yet we need a criterion to know what counts as truth. Let's consider a more concrete example. Suppose you are trying to figure out whether a new scientific theory is true. To decide if the theory is true, you would need some criterion or standard to guide you. This might involve things like empirical evidence, logical consistency, or consensus among experts. But how do you know whether these criteria are the right ones? You could argue that scientific methods have worked in the past to uncover truths about the world, but that itself is based on a certain standard of truth. To justify using these methods, you would need to show that they are reliable, but that's precisely the issue. You need to know that the methods are reliable in order to justify them, but you can't know that without already having a standard of truth to test them against. In another example, consider a person trying to figure out if a story they've been told is true. They may look for evidence, ask others, and check whether the story fits with what they already know. However, this method of verification depends on the assumption that their previous knowledge and reasoning are correct. But if they are unsure whether their reasoning is correct in the first place, they have no way of evaluating the new information. The problem of the criterion can also be illustrated by thinking about moral beliefs. Suppose someone is trying to determine whether an action is morally right or wrong. In order to decide, they need a standard of morality, something to guide their judgment. This could be a religious text, a moral theory, or personal intuition. But how do they know that their chosen standard is the right one? If they believe in a moral theory, how can they be sure that the theory itself is correct? In order to justify the use of this theory, they would need to already know something about moral truth. But if they don't know what's true in the first place, how can they choose the right moral theory? This is the essence of the problem of the criterion. We are caught in a loop. To decide what is true, we need a standard. But to choose the right standard, we need to already know what is true. The paradox seems inescapable. We cannot move forward in our search for truth without resolving this issue of how to justify the standards we use to judge truth. Philosophers have attempted to resolve the problem of the criterion in different ways. One approach is to adopt a method called foundationalism. Foundationalism holds that there must be some basic beliefs or standards that do not depend on other beliefs. These basic beliefs are self-justifying or certain, and they serve as the foundation for all other knowledge. In this view, we could start with some self-evident truths or basic criteria, and then build up our understanding from there. For example, we might start with the belief that our senses are generally reliable or that logical reasoning is valid. These foundational beliefs would provide the basis for all other knowledge, and we could use them to justify our standards for judging truth. Another approach is coherentism, which suggests that our beliefs are justified not by any foundational truths, but by the coherence of the whole system of beliefs. In this view, we don't need to find a starting point to justify all our beliefs. Instead, we determine the truth of a belief by how well it fits with the rest of our beliefs. If the new belief fits well with our existing beliefs and does not lead to contradictions, it can be considered justified. Coherentism allows for a more fluid and interconnected system of knowledge, where our beliefs support and justify each other. However, this approach still faces challenges in dealing with the problem of the criterion, since we would need a coherent system to evaluate the truth of any belief, but the criterion for coherence itself remains an open question. Some philosophers take a more pragmatic approach, suggesting that the problem of the criterion may not be as problematic as it seems. They argue that we can move forward in our search for truth without needing to resolve this issue definitively. According to this view, our standards for truth are continually shaped and refined through experience and practical reasoning. While we might never have an absolute, unshakable criterion, we can still make progress by using the standards that work best in practice. Despite the different approaches, the problem of the criterion remains a fundamental challenge in epistemology. It forces us to consider what it means to know something and how we justify the methods we use to acquire knowledge. In any search for truth, we are constantly faced with the question of how to decide what counts as evidence and what methods of reasoning are valid. But to know what counts as evidence and valid reasoning, we must first determine the truth, and therein lies the paradox. In real-life situations, we constantly make decisions about what to believe and what criteria to use. We often rely on experience, expert opinions, and established methods of reasoning, but these sources of knowledge themselves are based on assumptions and standards that need justification. The problem of the criterion reminds us that the search for truth is not always as straightforward as we would like it to be. It challenges us to think critically about the standards we use to make judgments, and it raises deep questions about the nature of knowledge and how we can justify our beliefs. Buridan's ass is a classic thought experiment that presents a paradox about decision-making, often attributed to the medieval philosopher Jean Buridan. The paradox involves a donkey placed exactly halfway between two identical bales of hay and equally thirsty for water. In this scenario, the donkey, faced with two perfect options, each equally desirable and equally within reach, fails to make a choice and ultimately dies of starvation and dehydration. The paradox illustrates how perfect indecision, when no reason favors one option over the other, can lead to inaction and even negative consequences. The situation of Buridan's ass raises a key question about decision-making and rationality. The donkey, in this case, is capable of choosing either bale of hay or moving toward the water. But because the two options are identical, and the donkey has no reason to favor one over the other, it is paralyzed by indecision. The rational thing to do would be to choose one bale of hay or move toward the water, Yet the donkey remains stuck, unable to make a decision, and the result is fatal. The paradox highlights a problem that can occur in decision-making. When presented with two equally valid options, the inability to choose can lead to inaction, which in turn can result in undesirable outcomes. At first, it may seem like a situation that wouldn't occur in real life. After all, in the natural world, animals don't appear to be paralyzed by perfect indecision. A donkey would likely choose one bale of hay or the other without much hesitation, or perhaps walk to the water first. But the essence of the paradox lies not in the donkey's real behavior, but in the theoretical framework it presents for thinking about rational choice and the consequences of overthinking or having too many equivalent options. The thought experiment can be applied to human decision-making as well. Imagine a person standing at a crossroads in their life, confronted with two equally appealing job offers, both with similar pay, benefits, and career advancement opportunities. The person struggles to decide between them, even though the decision is important. In such a scenario, a person could overanalyze every possible detail in an attempt to choose the perfect path. As the hours, days, or weeks pass, the inability to make a clear choice could lead to paralysis, indecision, and missed opportunities. This indecision is similar to what happens with Buridan's ass. The donkey, confronted with two identical choices, has no reason to prefer one over the other, leading to its failure to act. The same can happen to people when faced with multiple equivalent options. The choice becomes overwhelming because each option appears equally good, and the fear of making the wrong decision can make it harder to make any decision at all. The paradox, in this sense, isn't just about choosing between food and water, but about how humans and animals approach the problem of making decisions when options seem equal. At a deeper level, Buridan's ass also speaks to the nature of rationality. In classical philosophy, rationality is often seen as the ability to make decisions based on reason, evidence, or utility. Rationality is typically associated with the idea of making the best possible decision based on available information. In the case of Buridan's ass, the donkey's rational faculties fail not because it lacks the ability to think or reason, but because the reasoning process breaks down when all the options are equivalent. The paradox shows that rationality doesn't always lead to action. If every option is equally desirable and offers no clear advantage, the rational decision might be to do nothing at all, which leads to failure. This leads to another aspect of Buridan's ass, the problem of perfection. In some ways, the donkey situation reflects a human tendency to strive for perfection in decision-making. People often feel that they need to make the perfect choice, which may lead them to overanalyze and overthink the available options. In doing so, they might miss out on opportunities simply because they fail to choose any option at all. The paradox suggests that in situations where all options are equal, waiting for a perfect answer or solution can be as harmful as indecision itself. Sometimes it's better to make a choice, even if it isn't perfect, than to remain paralyzed by an overabundance of equally viable options. The philosophical implications of Buridan's ass can also be extended to the idea of free will. If the donkey is faced with two equally good choices and cannot choose between them, does this imply a failure of free will? Some interpretations suggest that the donkey's inability to choose shows a kind of determinism or lack of true freedom. After all, if the donkey is not forced to choose one over the other but simply fails to choose at all, then it seems as if the donkey's will is not truly free. Instead, it is trapped in a state of inaction, unable to break free from the indecision. This can lead to a discussion about the limits of free will in situations where all options appear equal, and the mind or will is incapable of selecting one option over another. The paradox also invites us to reflect on the human condition and how we make decisions in our own lives. In today's world, individuals are often confronted with an overwhelming number of choices. From choosing a career path to deciding what to eat for dinner, the sheer volume of options can create a sense of paralysis. The internet, for example, offers an endless stream of choices: what to buy, what to watch, where to travel, each option often presenting an illusion of perfection. This can lead to choice overload, where people become so overwhelmed by options that they avoid making a decision altogether. In some cases, they might even fail to take action, just like the donkey in Buridan's paradox. In addition, Buridan's ass has real-world implications in areas such as economics and consumer behavior. In economics, it is well known that when consumers are faced with too many options, they can become paralyzed and make no choice at all. This phenomenon is known as the paradox of choice. When people have too many choices, they may feel overwhelmed and dissatisfied, despite having a wealth of possibilities before them. This suggests that, in certain situations, having too many options can be just as problematic as having too few. The paradox also raises questions about human psychology and how we handle decision-making under uncertainty. In situations where we don't have enough information to make a clear choice, or when options seem too similar to each other, we can become stuck in indecision. Buridan's ass, in this sense, isn't just about theoretical donkeys and food. It's a reflection of a common human experience. We often find ourselves paralyzed by too many choices or by the fear of making the wrong one. The paradox challenges us to think about how we approach decisions and how we can overcome the fear of choosing poorly. The key takeaway from Buridan's ass is not just the tragedy of the donkey's indecision, but the larger implications it has for how we think about making choices in our own lives. It reminds us that perfect indecision can lead to inaction, and that sometimes it is better to choose, even imperfectly, than to remain stuck in the cycle of overthinking. The paradox pushes us to consider how we make decisions and what we might lose if we let fear, perfectionism, or overanalysis prevent us from acting. The paradox of analysis arises when we think about the nature of explanations and definitions. On the one hand, we expect a good explanation to reveal something new, something that we didn't already know. But on the other hand, if an explanation is correct, it should also seem obvious or self-evident once it is stated. This creates a tension. A good explanation should provide new insight, but if it's correct, it should feel like it was always there, waiting to be discovered. This paradox is rooted in the idea that explanations should add clarity, but the best explanations are often those that make us feel like we knew the answer all along. Let's break this down with an example. Imagine you ask someone to explain what a chair is. A simple explanation might be, a chair is a piece of furniture designed for sitting. This seems like a reasonable and obvious answer, and once we hear it, we might think, of course, that makes sense. But the explanation doesn't really reveal anything new. It just restates something we already knew in simpler terms. Seems obvious, but it didn't add new insight. It just clarified what a chair is based on what we already understood. Now, let's consider a more detailed explanation. Someone might say, a chair is a three-dimensional object with a flat surface, typically designed to support a person's body in a seated position, often having 4 legs, a backrest, and armrests. This is more specific and might add something new to the conversation. It describes a chair in a more technical way and might make us think more deeply about the physical features of a chair. But even though it's more detailed, it still feels somewhat obvious to us once we understand it. We've already experienced chairs in our daily lives, so the explanation doesn't feel entirely novel. It may be more precise, but it doesn't fundamentally change our understanding of what a chair is. This is where the paradox comes in. If an explanation is both correct and detailed, why doesn't it feel like it adds something radically new? Why does it seem so obvious, like we should have figured it out on our own? The paradox suggests that a good explanation should reveal something we didn't know before, but if the explanation is truly correct, then it should fit with our existing understanding in a way that makes it seem like it was always obvious. We are left wondering whether a good explanation can really be both new and obvious at the same time. This issue becomes even clearer when we think about definitions in philosophy or language. Take the word bachelor, for instance. The standard definition is an unmarried man. This seems simple enough, and once we hear it, we might think, well, of course, that's what a bachelor is. The explanation feels self-evident, even though it is offering a definition. So we're faced with a dilemma. If a definition is correct, it should clarify our understanding of a word, but it shouldn't feel like the answer was obvious all along. A definition that adds nothing new seems to fall short, even though it may still be correct. To dig deeper into this paradox, consider what it means for something to be new. When we expect an explanation to say something new, we mean that it should offer a perspective or insight that we hadn't considered before. For example, in science, an explanation that reveals a new law of nature or a new way of understanding how things work can be revolutionary. However, in the case of something like a chair or the word bachelor, it's difficult to come up with an explanation that feels both novel and correct. We already have a certain understanding of what these things are, so any explanation will inevitably feel like it's just reinforcing what we already know, even if it's stated more formally or precisely. Philosophers have long grappled with this paradox, especially in the field of epistemology, the study of knowledge and belief. The paradox suggests a challenge in our understanding of how explanations work. When we seek to explain something, we're usually looking for a way to make it clearer, to break it down into something simpler or more understandable. But once we have the explanation, we often find that the concept was already accessible to us, just in a more complex or less obvious form. The explanation is true, but it doesn't feel like it reveals anything new. The paradox arises because the more obvious and true an explanation is, the less it seems to offer. Take the example of a scientific theory, like Newton's law of motion. Before Newton, people had ideas about how objects moved, but they didn't have a unified theory that explained motion in a systematic way. Newton's law brought clarity and was revolutionary at the time. It gave us a new way of understanding movement and force. But today, Newton's theory seems obvious because it's something we learn early on in our education, and it feels like common sense once we understand it. The paradox is, if the explanation is truly accurate and effective, it should be so clear that it's almost self-evident, but it also shouldn't lose its value by becoming too familiar. The paradox of analysis doesn't just apply to everyday objects or scientific theories. It extends to more abstract concepts as well. Think of the concept of justice. Philosophers have spent centuries trying to define justice, and each definition or explanation adds layers of complexity and nuance. But in the end, the most basic definition of justice might be something as simple as fairness or giving each person what they deserve. Once we hear this explanation, it feels obvious, but it doesn't feel new. It doesn't give us a radically different way of thinking about justice. Instead, it reinforces something we already know, making the explanation seem both useful and, at the same time, somewhat lacking in novelty. This tension between newness and obviousness extends to how we approach learning and understanding. When we study a subject or try to understand a concept, we seek explanations that clarify things we don't yet know. But the more we understand, the more the explanations seem to become obvious, even though they still hold value. It's a constant balance between recognizing something for the first time and realizing that it was always there, just waiting to be noticed. One way to think about resolving the paradox is to focus on the distinction between learning something new and understanding something deeply. At first, an explanation might offer new insight, but over time, as we become more familiar with it, it becomes something we take for granted. The true value of an explanation lies not only in its ability to clarify, but in how it helps us gain a deeper understanding of a concept. The more we learn, the more obvious some explanations become. But that doesn't mean the explanations are no longer valuable. They've simply become a part of our broader understanding. The paradox also highlights the role of context in explanations. An explanation might seem obvious to an expert or someone already familiar with the subject, but to someone just starting to learn, it might provide a crucial breakthrough in understanding. What feels obvious to one person might not feel obvious to someone else. This adds an element of relativity to the paradox. What seems like a simple, self-evident explanation for one person might be entirely new and eye-opening to another. In a way, the paradox of analysis underscores the complexity of communication and understanding. It shows that even the simplest explanations can be valuable, as long as they provide clarity. An explanation that feels self-evident might be the very one that brings new insight to someone grappling with a concept for the first time. And while the explanation might not feel new once we understand it, it remains essential to our continued learning. The paradox challenges us to embrace the process of explaining and understanding, even when the explanations seem, at first, to be more obvious than groundbreaking. The Abilene Paradox is a situation where a group of people collectively decide to do something that none of them actually want to do, simply because each person assumes that everyone else wants to do it. This paradox highlights the way group dynamics and the fear of conflict can lead to decisions that go against the true preferences of the individuals involved. The name comes from a story about a family on a road trip in Texas. One day, the family is sitting at home, unsure of what to do. The wife suggests they all go to Abilene for a vacation, thinking it's a good idea. The husband, not wanting to upset her, agrees. The daughter, unsure but not wanting to challenge her parents, also agrees. And so, they all pile into the car and drive to Abilene, even though none of them really want to go. After several hours on the road, they finally reach Abilene and find that none of them are truly happy with the decision. It turns out that each person had only gone along with it because they assumed everyone else wanted it. Had they all spoken up, they could have avoided a trip they didn't want to take. But instead, they ended up in a situation where they all acted against their true preferences, just to avoid the discomfort of speaking up. This scenario is an example of how group dynamics can cause individuals to make choices that go against their own interests, simply because they don't want to appear out of step with the group. It's easy to see how this happens in a variety of social settings, from family vacations to workplace decisions. The desire to avoid conflict, or the fear of being seen as the one who rocks the boat, can lead to poor decisions for the entire group. The Abilene Paradox speaks to a common experience that many people have had. You might recall a time when a group of friends or coworkers decided to do something, like go to a restaurant, and no one was really excited about the choice. But instead of speaking up, everyone just went along with it, thinking that everyone else was happy with the decision. Later, someone might say, "I didn't really want to go either," and suddenly it becomes clear that no one was truly in favor of the decision. Each person assumed that someone else wanted it, so they kept quiet. This results in a situation where the group as a whole does something that no one actually wanted, simply because of miscommunication and a failure to express individual preferences. The root cause of the Abilene Paradox is a lack of communication. If each person had clearly expressed their own feelings and preferences, the group could have avoided the situation altogether. But instead, each member of the group assumed that others were in favor of the decision, so they remained silent. This phenomenon is often driven by the desire to maintain harmony or avoid being seen as a troublemaker. People fear that voicing their true feelings might disrupt the group or create conflict, so they go along with what they think others want, even if it's not in their best interest. This paradox can be particularly problematic in situations where important decisions are being made. In a workplace, for example, a team might agree to pursue a project that no one is truly passionate about, simply because everyone assumes that others are on board. The result is a lack of enthusiasm and commitment to the project, which can lead to poor results. In relationships, whether between friends, family members, or colleagues, the Abilene Paradox can lead to resentment, frustration, and a sense of disconnection. The failure to communicate openly can cause people to feel misunderstood or unappreciated, leading to negative outcomes for everyone involved. In a way, the Abilene Paradox is a reflection of how social pressure and the desire for consensus can sometimes cloud our judgment. We've all experienced moments when we've gone along with something just to avoid being the one to speak up. This is especially true in group settings, where there can be an unspoken expectation to conform to the majority opinion. But the result is that, instead of making decisions that truly reflect the preferences of the group, everyone ends up going along with something they don't want. The group may end up stuck in a situation where no one is happy, and the underlying issue, lack of communication, remains unresolved. One of the key lessons of the Abilene Paradox is the importance of open, honest communication in group decision-making. In any group, it's essential that everyone feels comfortable expressing their true preferences and concerns. When people feel safe to voice their opinions without fear of judgment, the group can make decisions that are more aligned with everyone's needs and desires. This requires a culture of trust and mutual respect, where differing opinions are seen as valuable rather than disruptive. A useful strategy for avoiding the Abilene Paradox is to create an environment where everyone's input is actively encouraged. In a meeting, for example, a leader can ask each person to share their thoughts on a proposed idea before a decision is made. This can help ensure that everyone's voice is heard and that no one is simply going along with something they don't want. It's also helpful to regularly check in with the group throughout a process to make sure that everyone remains on the same page and that no one feels pressured into making a decision they're not comfortable with. Another important aspect of avoiding the Abilene Paradox is recognizing that disagreement is a natural part of decision-making. Not every group decision will satisfy everyone, and that's okay. What's important is that each person's opinion is given equal weight and that everyone feels like they have a say. In some cases, a group might need to make a compromise or find a solution that accommodates everyone's needs. But the key is to ensure that the decision is made through open discussion, not through silent agreement or passive compliance. Sometimes it can be helpful to reflect on past experiences where the Abilene Paradox occurred. By recognizing when you've gone along with something simply because you assumed others wanted it, you can learn to spot similar situations in the future and avoid falling into the same trap. This can help you become more aware of the pressures that influence your decision-making and encourage you to be more proactive in expressing your own preferences. In everyday life, the Abilene Paradox can show up in seemingly trivial situations, like choosing where to eat or what movie to watch. But it can also appear in more significant decisions, such as career choices, relationships, or major family decisions. The key to avoiding it is to be conscious of your own preferences and to feel comfortable sharing them with others. When everyone in a group feels empowered to speak up and express their true desires, it's much easier to make decisions that everyone can be happy with. Ultimately, the Abilene Paradox serves as a reminder that true consensus and group harmony come from honest communication, not from assuming what others want. By fostering an environment where everyone feels safe to share their opinions and preferences, you can avoid the trap of making decisions that no one actually desires. It's a reminder that silence or conformity doesn't lead to true agreement, and that the best decisions are often the result of open dialogue, not just passive participation. The Andromeda Paradox explores a situation that highlights the complexity of perception, time, and knowledge. It suggests that two people walking down a street might have very different views on whether aliens have already invaded a galaxy millions of light years away. The paradox arises because of the way light and information travel across space, and how the concept of time affects our understanding of events in distant places. Let's begin by understanding what the paradox is really about. Imagine two people, let's call them person A and person B. Both of them are walking down the same street at the same time, but one person believes that aliens have already invaded the Andromeda galaxy. The other person disagrees, thinking that this event hasn't happened yet. On the surface, these two people might seem to be simply debating a distant event, something that is, at most, a matter of opinion. But the disagreement is actually based on a fundamental difference in how time and information travel through space. To make this clearer, think about the speed of light. The distance between the Earth and the Andromeda galaxy is roughly 2.5 million light-years. This means that any light or any other signal traveling from Andromeda to Earth would take 2.5 million years to arrive. So, when we look at Andromeda with a telescope, we aren't seeing it as it is right now. Instead, we are seeing it as it was 2.5 million years ago. The light we see today left the galaxy 2.5 million years ago, meaning that the image we observe is frozen in the past. Now, let's take this concept and apply it to the idea of an alien invasion. Suppose that, in the present moment on Earth, Person A has read a report or has been told that aliens have invaded Andromeda. But, since the light from that galaxy takes 2.5 million years to reach us, the invasion must have occurred millions of years ago. If we were to look at Andromeda, we would not see any evidence of the invasion yet, because the light reflecting that event hasn't reached us yet. This creates a disconnect between the two perspectives. Person B, on the other hand, may believe that the invasion is still far in the future. After all, they haven't seen any sign of it. In their view, they might feel that any claim of an alien invasion is an exaggeration, because the invasion is something that hasn't happened yet from their perspective. But in reality, according to the way light and information travel, the event of the invasion has already occurred. It's just that the evidence of it hasn't reached Earth yet. To Person A, the invasion has already happened, but they're only waiting for the information to arrive. This paradox speaks to a deeper issue with how we understand events that happen far away from us, especially in the context of vast distances like those in space. It shows how the delay in information reaching us from distant places creates a temporal disconnect between the event itself and our knowledge of it. The reality is that the event has already occurred, but for us, it remains in the past, inaccessible and hidden by the time it takes for the light to reach us. The farther away an event happens, the longer it takes for us to observe it, even though, in absolute terms, the event may have already been over long ago. To make this concept more relatable, consider the example of watching fireworks. If you are standing far away from the fireworks display, there's a noticeable delay between the explosion of the firework and the sound reaching you. Even though the firework exploded, the sound hasn't yet traveled to where you are. You can see the explosion but can't hear it until a few seconds later. This time delay creates a gap between what you observe and when it actually happened. In a similar way, the Andromeda Paradox suggests that we observe the universe with a built-in time lag, where the events we observe are already in the past. This creates a strange situation when we think about events in distant galaxies like Andromeda, or even in our own universe, where things like alien invasions or other large-scale cosmic events may have already taken place, but we simply haven't received the information about them yet. The paradox is not just about people disagreeing on facts, but about the nature of time itself. How can two people disagree on whether aliens have invaded a galaxy when, in fact, the event they're debating has already happened, but they are simply observing different moments in time? The Andromeda Paradox also forces us to reconsider our understanding of knowledge. How do we know what is happening right now, in real time, when our knowledge of events is always delayed? This is especially important when we think about our understanding of the universe. For example, when we observe distant stars or galaxies, we are looking at light that was emitted long ago. We can never see the universe as it is in the present moment. Instead, we always see it as it was in the past, because of the time it takes for light to reach us. The Andromeda Galaxy itself, for instance, is 2.5 million years away, so when we look at it, we are not seeing it as it is now, but as it was millions of years ago. The paradox doesn't just apply to galaxies and alien invasions. It's a fundamental issue with our entire understanding of the cosmos. If information from distant places always takes time to reach us, then how do we ever know what is happening right now, anywhere in the universe? This question challenges our concept of real-time knowledge and forces us to confront the idea that we can never fully experience events as they happen, especially when they occur far from us. Additionally, the Andromeda Paradox can also be thought of in terms of communication. If you and I were on opposite sides of the universe, and we tried to communicate by sending signals back and forth, there would be a time delay between our messages. This means that the conversation would always be out of sync. If I asked you a question, I wouldn't receive your response until years or even millions of years later. Even though we are both living in the present moment, the time it takes for our signals to travel means that our shared experience of now is never perfectly aligned. The paradox invites us to think about how we experience time. When we observe something, we assume that we're seeing it as it is in the present. But because of the vast distances in space and the speed of light, the information we receive is always a reflection of the past. Our understanding of the present is always tempered by the limitations of how far light can travel. This raises the question of whether we can ever truly experience the present as it is, or whether we are always living in a world that is, in some sense, already behind us. To resolve the Andromeda Paradox, we must recognize that the disagreement between person A and person B arises not from a difference in knowledge or facts, but from a difference in perspective shaped by the nature of time and space. Both of them are correct in a sense. The invasion has already happened, but person B just hasn't received the information about it yet. This paradox forces us to think about how time and space shape our understanding of the universe and how the limits of our perception affect our knowledge of what is happening now. The paradox doesn't just highlight a misunderstanding between two people. It reflects a deeper challenge in how we comprehend the flow of time and the universe's vast distances. The self-taught paradox raises an interesting and somewhat puzzling question. If you teach yourself something, where did the initial spark of knowledge come from? It seems straightforward that when someone teaches themselves a skill or concept, they are relying on their own resources and efforts. But when we dig deeper into the process, it becomes clear that knowledge has to come from somewhere, and the paradox challenges us to figure out where that something is. Let's break it down with a simple example. Suppose someone teaches themselves how to play the guitar. They begin by picking up a guitar, learning basic chords, and practicing regularly. Over time, they get better and better at playing. But where did the knowledge to play the guitar come from in the first place? Even though this person is learning on their own, they are drawing from a larger pool of knowledge, whether from books, videos, or even other musicians they have observed. In this sense, even self-taught learning isn't entirely self-generated. it still depends on outside influences. Now, let's go a little deeper. What if someone is teaching themselves something that doesn't exist in books or videos, something more abstract, like a new approach to thinking or problem solving? This creates a different problem. The person might believe they are learning entirely through their own thoughts and ideas. But how can this be possible if their thinking is influenced by previous knowledge and experiences? Even the ability to think critically or problem solve comes from prior learning and experiences, which are in turn shaped by the society, culture, and environment the person was raised in. This paradox isn't just limited to learning technical skills. It also applies to intellectual development and personal growth. For instance, a self-taught philosopher might believe that they arrived at a profound insight on their own. However, their thinking is often rooted in ideas they encountered, even indirectly, throughout their life. This raises the question of whether anyone truly learns or develops entirely in isolation from external influences. Is it possible to develop a completely new idea? Or are we always building on something we have encountered before? To further explore this paradox, let's consider the process of creating something original. Many famous artists, writers, and inventors have claimed that their best work was inspired by their own ideas. But these ideas are often the product of years of exposure to other people's works and concepts. Even if someone seems to create something entirely original, it is still shaped by the environment, experiences, and influences they've encountered. For example, an artist might claim to have created a new style of painting. But upon closer examination, we see that the artist's style was influenced by previous movements, techniques, and artists, even if they did not consciously intend to mimic them. So, when we say someone is self-taught, we need to consider how much of their learning is based on their own discoveries and how much is influenced by the world around them. This paradox challenges the idea of pure originality. If all knowledge and creativity are influenced by what has come before, can we ever truly say we've created something from scratch? It's possible that every new idea, no matter how innovative, has a foundation in previous knowledge. Even the act of teaching oneself a new concept or skill involves using tools and methods developed by others. So, the self-taught learner isn't really operating in a vacuum. They may be independent in their learning process, but they are still reliant on prior knowledge in some form, whether it's from others directly or from the culture they are part of. Consider the example of someone learning to code. They might pick up a programming language by reading books or watching tutorials, but the language itself was developed by others. The entire structure of the language, the syntax, the way it operates, all of this was created before the learner ever picked up a book or video on the subject. The self-taught coder is building on this existing framework. Even if they don't learn in a classroom or with a teacher, they are still working within a system of knowledge that they did not create. In this way, their learning is not entirely self-generated. It is influenced by the knowledge that was created by others and made available to them. This is where the paradox really becomes intriguing. If everything we know is based on some form of prior learning, then is there such a thing as self-taught knowledge? Can we ever say that we've come up with something entirely on our own? Or is every idea the result of prior knowledge, even if we are unaware of the sources? The very idea of being self-taught is built on the assumption that we can isolate certain knowledge as being independent. But in reality, our thinking and learning are shaped by everything we've encountered throughout our lives. At this point, it's helpful to consider how knowledge and learning are transferred. In formal education, we recognize that learning occurs through structured methods: teachers, textbooks, and courses. But even in self-teaching, we are still often using these same methods in a more informal way. For example, a self-taught musician may use online tutorials, YouTube videos, and music books to learn a song. While they might not have a formal teacher, they are still relying on the knowledge that others have created and shared. This shows that self-teaching is often not as independent as it may seem, as it still involves external sources of knowledge. Moreover, the idea of self-teaching assumes that the learner is acting independently and is able to critically assess and synthesize information. But even critical thinking itself is a skill that must be learned. It doesn't come naturally. We learn how to think critically by observing how others think and by practicing these skills over time. In this sense, even self-taught critical thinking is influenced by the methods and approaches of others. The tools for learning and thinking are not truly self-made. They are shaped by experiences and external inputs that the learner has encountered, whether through formal education, observation, or the broader culture. In addition, we should think about how innovation works. If every new idea is built upon previous knowledge, how do we account for innovation and breakthroughs? After all, many groundbreaking discoveries or pieces of art feel truly original and new. The difference lies in how individuals synthesize existing knowledge in new and unique ways. Innovation doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens when someone takes what is already known and applies it in a novel context or mixes existing concepts in a new way. So, while innovation may feel self-generated, it is still deeply connected to the knowledge that has come before it. To illustrate this, consider the example of a self-taught scientist who develops a new theory in physics. While the scientist may have independently arrived at a new idea, that idea is still based on existing principles of science and physics. Even the act of making a new discovery is part of a larger framework of scientific thinking that has been shaped by previous generations of thinkers. So, while the scientist might be seen as self-taught, their discovery is still rooted in a tradition of scientific knowledge that they did not create themselves. The self-taught paradox, therefore, highlights the complexity of knowledge and learning. It suggests that even when we believe we are learning or discovering something on our own, we are inevitably influenced by external sources. Our thinking is shaped by the world around us, by the people we interact with, and by the culture in which we live. While we may believe that we are teaching ourselves, the reality is that even our most independent ideas are built on a foundation of prior knowledge. In conclusion, the self-taught paradox forces us to reconsider the nature of learning and knowledge. It challenges the idea that any knowledge can be entirely self-generated and reminds us that our learning is always shaped by the world around us. Even the most independent thinkers are deeply influenced by the ideas and resources that came before them. The paradox encourages us to think more deeply about the interconnectedness of knowledge and the ways in which we learn, grow, and innovate. The Berry paradox is a self-referential puzzle that arises when we try to define something based on its own limitations. The paradox can be stated simply: the smallest positive number that cannot be defined in fewer than 11 words. The problem comes when you realize that the phrase you just read, the one that tries to define this number, uses only 10 words. But this phrase was specifically created to define a number that, according to the definition, should require at least 11 words. This leads to a contradiction because if the phrase is valid, then it cannot be valid. The paradox highlights a common issue in self-referential statements and sets of definitions. At its core, it's an issue of defining something while simultaneously describing its limitation in the process. If a number is defined as the smallest number that cannot be described with fewer than 11 words, yet the description itself is only 10 words long, then the definition fails. This failure creates a situation where the concept doesn't hold, as it exists in a state of conflict with its own rule. To break this down with an analogy, imagine a rule that says, the shortest word in the dictionary that is unexplainable in under 5 words is banana. Now, if someone were to try to explain the word banana in fewer than 5 words, such as a yellow fruit, it would break the rule, because banana was specifically defined as the shortest word that couldn't be explained in under 5 words. The paradox happens because the explanation you just gave already contradicts the rule by making it possible to explain the word in fewer words than the rule permits. Similarly, in the Berry paradox, you define something that inherently defies its own definition. This paradox is a form of a more general category of paradoxes called self-referential paradoxes, where a statement refers back to itself in a way that creates a contradiction. The classic example of a self-referential paradox is the liar paradox, which states, this statement is false. If the statement is true, then it must be false, but if it is false, it must be true. These types of paradoxes challenge our understanding of logic and truth because they seem to break the usual rules of reasoning. The Berry paradox does something similar in the realm of definition. It tries to define something using a limitation in the definition itself, which creates an inherent contradiction. The phrase, the smallest positive number that cannot be defined in fewer than 11 words, is supposed to identify a specific number, but by its very construction, it already fails to meet its own criteria. The paradox reveals an issue with the way we think about definitions and the limits of language. When we try to describe or define something while simultaneously setting a restriction on that description, we can easily fall into logical traps. In practical terms, the Fermi Paradox draws attention to the limitations of language. It asks us to think carefully about how we construct definitions and how rules interact with the things they define. The paradox isn't just an abstract puzzle. It illustrates the difficulties that arise when we impose arbitrary constraints on language and logic. It shows that even simple definitions can become problematic if we are not careful about how they are framed. The paradox also brings up interesting questions about how we understand the smallest number or any form of minimality. When we define something as the smallest or the first, we often rely on some kind of ordering system. In this case, the smallest number that cannot be defined in fewer than 11 words is a position within a hierarchy of numbers, but the paradox suggests that this hierarchy is unstable. It's not simply a matter of counting numbers. It's about how those numbers are defined and how their definitions interact with the language used to describe them. This concept has been explored in philosophy and logic for centuries. Philosophers and logicians have often been concerned with how language and definitions can shape our understanding of the world. And the Fermi Paradox is one example of the difficulties that can arise when trying to define something in precise terms. It highlights a fundamental problem in both formal logic and everyday language. Definitions are inherently limited by the words we use to create them. The paradox shows that when we try to define something with constraints or limitations, we may inadvertently set up a situation where the definition becomes impossible or contradictory. Moreover, the Fermi Paradox raises important questions about the nature of infinity and unboundedness. In the paradox, the definition is trying to identify a number that is beyond our ability to clearly define, which brings in ideas from set theory and the concept of infinity. Numbers, as abstract concepts, are part of an infinite set, and when we try to impose limits on how those numbers are defined, we encounter contradictions. The paradox suggests that there may be limits to how we can define and understand even the most basic elements of mathematics. In addition to the logical challenge it presents, the Fermi Paradox also brings attention to the complexities of self-referential systems. In mathematics, systems like set theory and formal logic are often designed to avoid contradictions, but the Fermi Paradox shows how these systems can break down when we allow for self-reference. It demonstrates that the act of defining something can sometimes create problems that are difficult to resolve, even within a perfectly logical framework. This is a reminder of how language and logic can be both powerful and fragile at the same time. When we try to use language to capture the world around us, we often rely on definitions to clarify and explain concepts. But the Fermi Paradox suggests that even our best definitions can become tangled and paradoxical when we set too many limits on them. It forces us to confront the complexity of language and meaning and the potential for contradictions in systems that rely on strict rules and definitions. By exploring the paradox, we gain a deeper understanding of how language works and how we can use it to describe the world without falling into logical traps. In conclusion, the Fermi Paradox is more than just a puzzle. It challenges our assumptions about definitions, language, and logic. It shows that the very act of defining something can lead to contradictions if we are not careful with how we construct our definitions. This paradox not only highlights the limitations of language, but also asks us to think more deeply about how we define and understand the world around us. The Doomsday Argument is a thought experiment that raises unsettling possibilities about the future of humanity by using probability and assumptions about our position in the timeline of human existence. The central idea is that, given certain statistical reasoning, it's likely that we are living in the middle of human history, not at the beginning or the end. If this is the case, it suggests that the future of humanity might not last as long as we might hope, and the end could come sooner than we think. The argument starts with the assumption that there is nothing particularly special about any individual human being's position in time. That is, there is no reason to believe that we are any more likely to be living at the beginning or end of human history than anyone else. So, if we imagine that human history stretches from its beginning to its end, we would expect, on average, to be living at a time that is somewhere in the middle of that timeline. This leads to a chilling conclusion. If the middle of human history is around us, it means that humanity might be closer to its end than to its beginning. To understand this more clearly, let's consider a simplified version of the argument. Imagine humanity has been around for a certain amount of time, and we expect it to continue for a long time into the future. If you're born at a random point in time, you're just as likely to be born closer to the beginning of human history as you are to be born closer to the end. If we then consider that humanity has already existed for thousands of years, there's a significant chance that we're somewhere near the middle of that timeline. But the problem is that if we're near the middle, it also means that the end of humanity could be approaching more quickly than we might like to think. One way to approach this idea is to think of it in terms of large numbers. If we assume that human history is going to last for, say, 1,000 years, the odds of you being born in the first half of that timeline are very high. But if we assume that humanity could potentially last for millions of years, the probability of us being in the middle of that timeline becomes much lower. Therefore, the more extended the potential future of humanity, the more likely it is that we are currently living at a time much closer to the end rather than the beginning. The Doomsday Argument is often framed with the concept of the number of future humans. If humanity is going to produce many more generations of people, and we have no special reason to think we are living in the first or last generation, then the fact that we exist now suggests that the total number of humans may be much lower than we hope. This is because our position in the timeline, whether at the beginning, middle, or end, affects the probability of human extinction happening soon. If we're right in the middle, the argument goes, it means humanity's survival might not be as long as we typically imagine. In one version of the Doomsday Argument, the reasoning is tied to the anthropic principle, which suggests that we can only observe the universe from our current standpoint. From this perspective, our very existence is a result of the likelihood that we would be born in the middle of human history. We wouldn't be able to observe human history from the beginning or end of its timeline, so our position in the middle might not be as random as we assume. In other words, if humanity is going to last for many generations, we should expect to be born at a point in the timeline where we are neither at the very start nor the very end. The unsettling implication of this argument is that it places a limit on how much time humanity might have left. If we're living in the middle of human history, then the end could be nearer than we realize. This doesn't necessarily mean that humanity will go extinct soon, but it introduces the possibility that the future of humanity might be much shorter than our current optimistic projections. There are several counterarguments to the Doomsday Argument, though. One of the main critiques is that it makes assumptions about our position in the timeline without enough data to support them. For instance, we don't know how many people will eventually live on Earth or how long human civilization will last. Our assumptions about the future of humanity are based on a number of uncertain factors, such as technological advancements, environmental changes, and socio-political developments. So, the Doomsday Argument can be seen as overly simplistic because it doesn't take into account the many unknowns that could influence the trajectory of humanity's future. Another critique is that the argument assumes a uniform distribution of births, meaning that we're just as likely to be born at any point in history. However, some argue that humanity's future isn't just a random statistical process. Instead, it could be shaped by a number of factors, including our choices, technological progress, or even the potential for space colonization. If humanity can extend its reach into space, for example, it could survive for far longer than the Doomsday Argument suggests. Despite these critiques, the Doomsday Argument forces us to think about our place in the timeline of human history and the future of our species. It challenges us to confront the possibility that humanity's future may not be as long as we assume, and it raises important questions about how we should think about the long-term survival of our civilization. Should we act as if humanity is at the midpoint of its history? And if so, what can we do to ensure that we survive and thrive for the long term? In conclusion, the Doomsday Argument is a thought-provoking idea that uses statistical reasoning to suggest that humanity might be closer to its end than we expect. It raises questions about our position in time and the likelihood of our extinction, forcing us to reconsider the future of humanity. While the argument is not without its flaws, it serves as a reminder that we should take the long-term survival of our species seriously and think carefully about how we prepare for the future. The paradox challenges our assumptions about time, survival, and the nature of existence itself, inviting us to consider how much longer humanity might last and what we can do to shape that future.